Barcelona, August 1992. During the late Olympic summer of 1992, just days before the superstars of the American basketball team were expected to easily trounce all comers and claim their gold medals, the most casual of sports fans and news on-the-hour regulars learned that certain members of the vaunted Dream Team seemed bent on denigrating one of the most hallowed rituals in all of sports. This, the news report said, because of their preference in footwear. Officials of the United States Olympic Committee announced that if Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, David Robinson, John Stockton, Scottie Pippen, and Chris Mullin, Nike endorsers composing half of the American team, did not relent and wear the official American flag-bedecked awards ceremony jackets, also bearing the emblem of Reebok, the athletic shoe company against which Nike had conducted a holy war for much of a decade. The players would not be allowed atop the medal stand when some 600 million television viewers in 193 countries heard the Star-Spangled Banner begin. But Michael Jordan and the other Nike guys on the Dream Team refused to budge. "We won't wear Reebok," Jordan said. As news of the standoff spread, phone calls began to pour into Nike headquarters in Oregon. By 1992, Nike had become one of those rare corporations that members of the public think to call on the telephone for reasons not connected to the products Nike sold. A recent magazine-based advertising campaign featuring lengthy, often poetic messages addressing the feelings and passions of American women had inspired thousands of phone calls to the World Campus in Beaverton. Many of the callers wanted copies of the ads for their refrigerators and bulletin boards, and others simply wanted an anthropomorphized Nike to know how the ads had touched them. But almost every telephone call inspired by the burgeoning Dream Team affair in Barcelona at the 25th Olympic Games indicated that the Nike public believed the company was orchestrating an impending embarrassment, and that, this time, the shoe warriors had simply gone too far. Here, after all, was a sports moment meant to reside above the marketplace, an event indicative of sport's traditional purity of purpose, the flag unfurled and the national anthem on the public address system, the tears of young athletes glistening in the arc lights. And yet certain ostentatiously remunerated basketball players seemed willing to deny the nation this experience because of loyalty not to the flag, to the glory of sport or honor of our teams, as the Olympic oath has it, but to a company in Oregon that markets their shoes. Charles Barkley, soon to become the star power forward of the Phoenix Suns, and a veritable Tocqueville when moved to observe a complex social phenomenon and distill its essence, managed to underscore the perception that Mammon was about to triumph over Patria in Barcelona by proclaiming that he had no less than 2 million reasons not to wear Reebok. As a result of his marriage, as they say in the world of modern sports marketing, to Nike, Barkley was being paid $1 million as an annual guarantee. Charles would also be paid $1 million more over a year by Nike, pursuant to his contractual right to 2% of the net wholesale price of the popular Nike Air Force basketball shoes he wears. These days, Barkley reflected not long after the Olympics ended, you play a sport very well, and that takes you to a certain level by itself. But Nike can take you way beyond that. Nike has helped me make a whole lot of money, and I'm not about to forget it. If Barkley had more than 2 million reasons to refuse to be a human billboard for Reebok in Barcelona, then Michael Jordan, with his much larger guarantee and his 5% of the wholesale price of every pair of Air Jordans sold, was in the process of accumulating some 20 million reasons to remain loyal to Phil Knight and Nike over the course of 1992. All of this was occurring in an era when most Americans had come to accept that Michael Jordan, Bo Jackson, and Michael Jackson shared a great deal more than aspects of their proper names, an era in which most children realized that Jordan sits on the bench wearing a hat bearing Nike's famous logo, not only to keep his head warm. When the sports pages of metropolitan newspapers have come to resemble the business pages of the recent past, when the business pages look like the sports pages of old, and when player salaries are divided by batting averages like earnings divided by outstanding shares. But Phil Knight still sensed that the Reebok warm-ups controversy could become a problem. This was the kind of controversy that could loosen Nike's special hold on the popular imagination. Knight had decided not to go to the Olympics, though he could have gone to the restless capital city of the Catalans and sat beside sheiks and prime ministers in the front rows. "Too many people come up to me at the track and field events I love to watch," he said when he decided not to make the trip. "The Olympics have actually become kind of a pain for me." Knight usually loves to go to track events, and he enjoys watching tennis. Students of Nike who are aware of Knight's extremely introverted nature are occasionally shocked to see him stand up during tennis matches to yell and scream like a hockey fan at rinkside, occasionally during moments of general silence. But for the most part, Knight is famous for not showing up where he might be expected, and since actually being there for the big game or the annual trade show is so essential to others who work for businesses connected to sports, he had managed to underscore his power over the years through the simple act of staying away. The constant refusals to be interviewed or appear at the right business roundtables have given rise to general characterization of Knight as shy, though few observers think the Nike chairman's reticence compromises the man's fervid determination to win each and every game he plays. Knight tends to end his rare exhortations of the Nike troops with 2 words: "Let's win." He directs a company named not for the Greek goddess overseeing sport or play, but for the goddess of victory. And from the first time he heard about the impending public relations fiasco in Barcelona, Knight realized that the medals stand outfit battle was one Nike could not win, except in the most Pyrrhic way. But he also realized that the problem was going to be very difficult to fix, since it involved the will and competitive resolve of Nike's own ultimate warrior and in-house Superman, Mr. Jordan. When the broad sheaves of computer printout bearing one-line conversation summaries had been generated by the stream of angry phone calls coming into the 800-number operators over in the Mike Schmidt building, Knight thought back to an evening he'd spent with Jordan 5 weeks earlier, when Jordan was in Portland with the Dream Team for the Tournament of the Americas, a phase of the Olympic team qualification process. Before Knight and Jordan went out for a lengthy pasta dinner at Pazzo, the wood-lined restaurant in downtown Portland's Vintage Plaza Hotel, the Dream Team had humiliated the Cuban squad in what would turn out to be the only game the assembled superstars would play at anything above half speed. The Dream Team was the slam dunk of basketball squads, and as much fun as the best players in the world were having sharing the same colors, they all knew that they'd been assembled to dazzle and sell. There was never a hint of doubt that they would win. Jordan had originally told Knight that he didn't want any part of a professionalized Olympic competition. "It's for the kids," he'd said. "I have my gold medal already, from '84. I don't want you to play anyway," Knight had replied. "Why's that?" Jordan asked. "Because I'm afraid it will shorten your career." The American representatives to the Fédération Internationale de Basketball, FIBA, the World Basketball governing body that had made pro players eligible for the Barcelona Games, had actually voted against sending in America's famous pros, but the representatives from other countries wanted the basketball explosion on an international level to continue, and they were more than willing to sacrifice their own teams if the American superstars who appeared in those commercials would be willing to play. The Boston Celtics star Larry Bird had originally agreed that younger players should compose the American team, but then both Bird and Jordan got phone calls from Magic Johnson urging them to play. Johnson had recently revealed that he was HIV positive. He said that Barcelona might turn out to be his on-court swan song. After squashing Cuba, Jordan told Knight over dinner that Dave Gavitt, the president of the USA Basketball Organization responsible for drafting the pro Olympians, had taken him aside in the locker room after the game. So he tells me that we have to wear these special warm-ups on the medal stand that have a Reebok emblem on them, Jordan said. He said not our shoes, just these special outfits. What did you say? Knight inquired. I said, you know what, Dave? I have a real big problem with this. All of us on this team are hired guns, so let's not pretend we're anything else. All of us have endorsement deals with different companies. How can you have gone and sold these rights and expect us to wear these things? Gavitt, the senior executive vice president of the Boston Celtics, and a respected figure in both amateur and professional basketball circles, had tried to explain that the marketing of the medals uniforms was done separately from the official USA basketball paraphernalia. But Jordan told Knight that Gavitt appeared to understand his position and had vowed to fix the problem. Good going, Michael, Knight had said, though looking at the computer printouts reporting the content of phone calls and watching the news, Knight now fervently wished he'd said something less rousing to his most famous part-time employee. According to Howard White and the other Nike people working in Barcelona, Jordan noticed that the Reebok warm-ups problem had not been fixed while reading a legal document he was handed during the team's overseas flight. Included in the text of the Olympic Code of Conduct was a description of what would happen to an Olympian who commits a felony during the Games, a pledge not to use drugs, and a formal agreement to wear the official award suit. I'm not stepping up on any platform in Reebok, Jordan reiterated to Gavitt, and he proceeded to cross out and initial the offending clause. A discussion ensued among the other players on the plane, and soon most of the other Code of Conduct documents were amended in ink. This, Olympic Committee officials later said, for the first time anyone could recall. A few days later, on a flight headed for Barcelona from the Dream Team's first European stop, Monte Carlo, Gavitt told Jordan and the others that they simply had to wear the Reebok sweats if they wanted to formally receive the gold medals they would surely win. Jordan was furious when he bounded off the plane in Barcelona. I'm not wearing outfits that say Reebok, he said into the inevitable circle of reporters. Me neither, Charles Barkley chimed in. And so something of an international incident had commenced, and Heather Dodona and Lisa McKillibs, who deflect all but the most pressing requests for Philip Knight to establish personal contact with the non-Nike world, began to field calls from various senior Olympic officials in Barcelona. The Dream Teamers did relent during their game against the Angolan team by allowing the African squad to score 48 points to their own 116. The Angolans had scored only 1 point against the Dream Team during the Americans' early 46-point run, so the guys decided to lope. Charles Barkley distinguished himself during the contest by elbowing an Angolan player half his size. Charles later told reporters that the African athlete, who flew into the air as if he'd been hit by a car, probably hadn't eaten in a few weeks. Knight took a phone call from Dr. Harvey Schiller, the former sports marketing-minded commissioner of the Intercollegiate Southeastern Conference and the current executive director of the United States Olympic Committee. Schiller was calling from Barcelona to ask Knight to please call off his boys. I'm continuing to do what I can, Knight said, but the truth is I can't do much at all. The Olympic Committee and the press are all acting like I have a magic wand, Knight complained to Nike's 35-year-old VP for corporate communications, Liz Dolan, after Dolan called Knight to talk damage control from Barcelona. This is getting serious, Knight said. We have to get to Michael. Despite Michael Jordan's atavistic incapacity to back away from anything that looked remotely like a competitive challenge, it did seem entirely logical to most observers that if anyone could call Jordan off the attack, that person was Phil Knight. That residents of the Nike-conscious public even perceived Phil Knight and his company to be in control of public events in Spain was also not difficult to understand, grand orchestrations having become one of Nike's many fortes. Bo Jackson often says that he will never forget the day the piece of modern marketing lore called the Bo Knows campaign began. I was about to step to the plate from the on-deck circle at the 1989 All-Star Game when I looked up and saw a plane flying over the ballpark, trailing a huge Bo Knows banner. Then I looked up into the stands, and all I could see were Bo Knows signs and people putting Bo Knows hats on their heads. So Bo went to bat and homered massively, the celebration later fading into a commercial break, premiering the soon-to-be unavoidable Bo Knows television ad campaign. The timing of the commercial was no more a part of an advertising strategy than Bo's home run, but it looked as if the whole thing were part of a Nike master plan. For a very long time after that, Jackson recalls, turning on the television was like looking into a mirror. It all broke around me like a sudden storm. It was everywhere. Suddenly everyone knew me. Everything changed. Nike sends employee teams storming into a city to stage elaborate multimedia sound and light shows, replete with dozens of lycra-clad models, dancing around a hotel room for the benefit of 3 or 4 magazine editors. Long before industry trade shows began, railroad cars and semis full of Nike personnel and millions of dollars worth of Nike-abilia arrive to assure the company's continued image of world dominance and a knack for controlled orchestration of events. Though Knight says he rarely thinks about the power implicit in his control of the Nike machine, he was startled by the preponderance of Nike imagery covering the city of Melbourne when he attended the 1992 Australian Open. I turned one corner, and there, stretched across one of the biggest buildings in Melbourne, across the whole skyline it seemed, was a huge "Just Do It" banner, he recalled, and I stopped and let myself feel the enormous thrill. Where other sports apparel and equipment companies offered hospitality suites in Barcelona, Nike personnel had converted a nightclub next to the Torre Catalunya Hotel into an elegant ring of quiet, enclosed pods where athletes and other VIPs could relax and chat. The place was laden with fax machines and phones and mountains of food, and, as always, lots of athletic clothing and shoes to give away. A local cinema had been secured for a media event featuring Jordan, Barkley, the Ukrainian pole vault master, Sergei Bubka, and other Nike track and field stars. Before the 1,200 reporters filed into the movie theater, Michael Jordan arrived at the Nike Barcelona outpost. Security personnel created a cordon around one of the pods, where Jordan sat down with Howard White and Steve Miller, the recently elevated Nike Director of Sports Marketing and the General Overseer of the Nike stable of stars. Now 47, Miller had already been a Detroit Lion, the athletic director at Kansas State University, a college and high school track coach, and Nike departmental overseer of the company's many track and field relationships. A preternaturally extroverted man, he seems to have met every coach in North America at some point. With his squarish haircut, head, and squared, broad shoulders, Steve Miller looked like a prototype of the tough but caring coach he had been. When Miller had been hired to run the world's largest sports marketing organization less than 2 years earlier, Knight said, "You've got the best and the worst job in the company. It's the best because you can just about do anything you want in this business. It's the worst because I'm going to be watching you every step of the way." So much of Nike's public presence is hitched to the abbreviated half-lives of its athletes, to their health, performance, personal rectitude, and continued popularity, that staying on top for Nike had come to mean establishing a presence at every draft of amateur talent in every sport and every tournament. Every team had to have Nike players, so Steve Miller ran a department of more than 60 sports marketing specialists, each of whom was expected to know everything going on inside their respective games. "The PR side of this is impossible to win," Miller said to Jordan. "Hey, we're partners," Jordan replied, looking at his friend Howard White. "We spend a lot of time talking about ethics and pride. This is about ethics and pride to me. Well, look at this. We ought to battle this one out together." But as the Olympic Games progressed, even as Team Nike continued to rack up more medals than would be collected by the entire unified formerly Soviet, team. Efforts to control the fallout from the medals ceremony affair were getting nowhere. Several American sports writers who covered the NBA walked into the Barcelona office of United States Olympic Committee PR man Mike Moran. The journalists reiterated Michael Jordan's and his teammates' refusal to wear the medals outfit, and Moran quoted the Olympic Code of Conduct and went on to remind the writers that the money Reebok had paid the USOC supported athletes who might not have millions of dollars. The money went to fencers and wrestlers who in the past had had to crawl under chain-link fences at night to train, who worked long hours behind lunch counters, and whose parents made extreme sacrifices to support their children's determination to compete. Press reports soon carried word that Mike Moran of USOC had, in effect, called Michael Jordan and the other Nike holdouts greedy. Many Nike employees were deeply hurt by the perception that the company was stage-managing the controversy in Barcelona, that an overt lust for market share was causing Nike to act in ways inimical to the best interest of sports. Even employees still working as trainees knew that the whole pious idea behind Nike from the beginning had been to build a pedestal for sport such as the world had never seen. Nike was nothing if not an athlete's company, an organization by and for athletes. The athlete, Knight repeated often, remains our reason for being. Nike's customers were all athletes too. If this classification served to create a pipeline for fantasies connecting elite athletes and the consuming public, if it served to honor the customer, the statement was less than technically true in light of research that showed that at most 40% of Nike shoe buyers used the shoes for their intended sport. The vision also telegraphed a corporate desire to create covenants between customers and a special company, cast as a haven for people who identify completely with athletes and sports. When Phil Knight started Nike, the dominant athletic shoe corporation was the German firm Adidas, inventors of the modern soccer boot and other sport-specific footwear. In the view of Nike's anti-establishment founding fathers, Adidas was an elitist organization that was deeply entwined with the corrupt and aristocratic international sports authorities of the day. The Adidas guys were sports bureaucrats who wined and dined league officials and international fat cats. The early Nike guys, on the other hand, were athletes, almost all of them competitive long-distance runners at first. And via their own athletic pursuits, the young company acquired a decided preference for athletes over teams or the rule-makers controlling sport. There was an internal obsession with authenticity. The company would be dedicated to the proposition that authentic athletic desires would help create authentic products for authentic athletes. The cause of the individual athlete would become the company's cause. Michael Jordan holds us to our values. Nike executives, most of whom have never met him, would often say. The company exists, one formal statement of collective purpose proclaimed, to enhance people's lives through sports and fitness. Over and over again, they proclaimed that Nike's success was predicated upon a shared commitment to keeping the magic of sport alive. Sports marketing specialists estimated that by the 1990s, fully 7 times as many athletes were parties to working agreements with Nike as with any other company. Over half of the NCAA championship basketball teams of the past 10 years had worn Nikes, and more than 60 big-time colleges were Nike schools, this in most cases because their coaches were Nike coaches. Well over 200 of the 324 NBA players wore Nike shoes, over 80 of them by contract. 275 pro football players wore Nikes, as did 290 Major League Baseball players. By the summer of 1992, Nike had so masterfully connected its business aspirations to customers, sports, and high-profile athletes that the revenues the company would report at the end of the fiscal year in late May of 1993 were as large as those garnered from TV deals, tickets, and retailed paraphernalia by the National Football League, National Basketball Association, and Major League Baseball combined. 3 months before the Olympics, an interviewer from the Harvard Business Review asked Phil Knight why Nike used so many athletes to support company initiatives. "Because it saves a lot of time," Knight said. "You can't explain much in 60 seconds, but when you show Michael Jordan, you don't have to." Many of the business activities conducted by Nike were designed to help build a given sport. Anything that was good for sports, Knight often said, was good for Nike. Sports had arguably surpassed popular music as the captivating medium most essential to being perceived as young and alive, and sports, as never before, had so completely permeated the logic of the marketplace and consumer goods that by 1992, the psychological content of selling was often more sports-oriented than it was sexual. That members of the public could interpret Michael Jordan's loyalty to the corporate cause as bad for America and bad for sports testified to Knight's constant warning that the company's special relationship to all the pathos and nobility of athletics was forever vulnerable. Unlike automotive or computer dynasties, but just like sports dynasties and batters on hitting streaks, Knight argued that shoe empires would tend to ascend to extremely brief, Icarian moments near the sun. He believed that the modern athletic shoe empires, drawn together from fragments of much older shoe, clothing, and sporting goods industries, had risen and fallen through the post-World War II era according to natural cycles. First Converse had its day, then Adidas, then Nike. The cycle took us from $0 to $1 billion in a short time, and suddenly Reebok had its years in the sun. Then Nike was reinvented during the late 80s, and now we're back on top. Knight believed that there was even a relationship between the vicissitudes of Nike's influence and the cyclical shape of its premier athletes' careers. Even before the time of global hero creation, when Nike athletes were a few track stars and a small group of basketball players, the fortunes of company and athletes seem to be tied. And everything happens faster now, Knight would continue. In this business, every 6 months is like a new life. We can't take our eye off the ball, because if we lose it in the next 6 months, we'll have a son of a bitch of a time getting it back. It's just so fragile. We have to reawaken the consumer every 6 months. So everybody around here has to want the ball in the closing seconds. Everybody needs to win. Talk to a Nike manager about the company's ownership of 75% of the market in shoes with cleats on the soles, or 40% of the running shoe market, or 65% of the huge market in basketball shoes, the company's other basketball sub-brands besides Air Jordan, the Barkley-connected Force shoes, and the popular Flights, accounted for the sale of many more basketball shoes than Converse and Adidas combined. And he or she will invariably interrupt and soberly intone, "It's borrowed. No market in this business can be owned." The profits available to those who would artfully entwine products and sports are often said to have been discovered first by a St. Louis brewer named Chris Vonderay, who was so struck by the congruence of baseball fans and alcohol-related thirst that in 1881 he purchased the St. Louis Brown Stockings so he could sell his beer in the stands. By 1992, 150 MBA programs and law schools over the country offered extensive sports marketing courses or degrees. Hollywood entertainment lawyers continued to leave their firms to become highly paid sports agents or sports marketers for Nike or one of the other more than 4,000 separate companies spending billions of dollars on some manner of sports marketing. Statistics collected at the end of 1992 by International Events Group, Inc., would show that $2.1 billion was spent by North American companies on sponsorship of specific sports events, the figure dwarfing the $254 million spent on causes by corporations and the $233 million spent on the arts. Though participation in and observation of sports had exploded during the 80s, the sports marketing expansion was in large part a pragmatic reaction to the expense and relative inefficiency of traditional advertising. Sports endorsements, licensing deals, promotional tie-ins, and sponsorships were now perceived by marketers whose products and services were not remotely connected to sports as a way to achieve a more direct connection to the consumer's elusive will to spend. One study of the invasive force of sports marketing in 1986 emanated from an analysis of the value of the sugar substitute NutraSweet's position as sole sponsor of the United States Figure Skating Association. NutraSweet's television ads were blacked out during a skating event in selected markets, and yet the study showed that most viewers of the event were still quite sure that they'd seen NutraSweet commercials during the broadcast anyway. The past association of company and event had branded popular perception. Nike marketers enjoyed pointing out that the vast majority of people attending the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles thought Nike was an official sponsor, this because of all the Nike billboards observable all over the city, though Converse was in fact the corporate sponsor. No scoreboard, dasherboards around a hockey rink, sweatband, blimp, scorer's table, courtside folding chair, plastic water bottle, or halftime extravaganza now remained unclaimed by the forces of sports marketing. Events were sliced into sports moments and sold off as frameable parts. The kickoffs beginning National Football League halves were often sold separately to corporate sponsors. So was the announcement of the starting lineups before hundreds of televised contests. The photograph on the back of the Kellogg's cereal box depicted not just world-class American bike racers, but the winner of the Kellogg's Tour of Britain, the winner of the Thrift Drug Classic, the winner of the Nissan Tour of Ireland, and even the Motorola cycling team doctor. Kayak racers and competition snowboarders now wore patches and color combinations indicative of contractual corporate support that was formerly accorded only a handful of the most colorful tennis stars. Michael Jordan talked of his portfolio, a welter of business agreements that, to Phil Knight's chagrin, now included 7 to 8 figure endorsement and licensing deals with more than 15 different enterprises. This, according to Jordan's agent, David Falk, the result of a consolidation process that had brought the number of deals down from 18. Though a relative saturation of the United States market for athletic goods and apparel was achieved during the late 1980s, the sports marketing generals looked out at a world more girdled by new telecommunications capacity every day. They watched capitalism, or at least rampant consumer desire, emerge from the end of the $10 trillion Cold War, and they saw 1,000 potential brushfire wars over product and brand suzerainty, where forces arrayed behind competing ideologies had stood in opposition before. And Nike, by force of Knight's perception of the global continuum of sports, was already out there and heavily armed. To paraphrase Willie Sutton, Knight would say when questioned about the deployment of his global power brand, "We're going out into the world because that's where the feet are." Nike had begun propelling its sophisticated imagery into the European marketplace in 1985. In the Netherlands and in France, certain models of the Nike Air Max running shoe were already essential accoutrements of generational definition for European teens. Though the most recent Air Max retailed for 299 Dutch guilders in Amsterdam, over $155, the shoes are as indispensable to large numbers of young people along the canals as bell-bottoms were in the San Francisco Bay Area of 25 years ago. By the summer of 1992, the Nike International Division was fielding over 40 applications a day from citizens of the former Eastern Bloc who wanted to open up Nike distributorships in nations where Nike had come to represent sports and irreverence and cool. Nike's president, a former Kennedy White House and Boston lawyer named Dick Donahue, was stunned not long after the Olympics ended when a kid in Buenos Aires, Argentina, asked him if Chicago Bulls and Dream Team star Scottie Pippen was wearing a new shoe. Nike had sent Pippen the latest prototypes dreamed up by the designers in the Michael Jordan building on the Nike World Campus in Oregon, only 10 days before Donahue left for South America. 3 years earlier, the mention of Air Jordan had caused participants in focus groups in Osaka and Tokyo, Japan, to giggle, because Jordan rhymed with the Japanese word for joke. But now Air Jordan was the #1 shoe in Japan. A single television advertising onslaught in 1989 had elevated Nike from relative obscurity to the #2 most desired American brand among teenagers in Japan, the #1 spot going to Coke. Few people working for Nike had been more carefully tutored in the Nike way of playing out Nike's competitive urgencies than Michael Jordan. From Jordan's perspective, his job in Barcelona was to vanquish the competition, which included grinding down Reebok, as Nike's 41-year-old general manager Tom Clark had put it before the games began. Jordan had seen Nike's own ferocity of competitive impulse up close for years now, and he'd never seen Nike or Nike back away. Basketball, the Nike strategists believed, was on its way to dislodging soccer as the world game, and the dream team at the Olympics would be the best chance to show power basketball to the world. A year earlier, Michael Jordan was part of a Nike marketing caravan that had traveled through Europe. Several months later, it was difficult to find a wall or street lamp in Munich that failed to announce the imminent arrival of Nike stars Charles Barkley and Scottie Pippen for a colorful pre-Olympic festival of slam dunks and exhibition basketball. During the year preceding the Olympics, Nike's international sales had increased by over 33%, and the European market share controlled by Reebok and Nike combined was approaching 50% of total athletic footwear sales, up from just 5% a decade earlier. In an effort to grab 10% more of the market during 1993, Nike's ad planners had earmarked $50 million for European spending, for investment, as the ad dollars were now perceived by the Nike marketing gurus in Beaverton. The sports marketers at Reebok, Nike's estimable competitor from Massachusetts, had not a single endorsement athlete on the Dream Team. Reebok still had invested massively in the Olympic build-up, outspending Nike to produce a television campaign depicting American track and field athletes Dan O'Brien and Dave Johnson as two modern gladiators pitted in Olympic contests that would discern who was the greatest athlete in the world. The winner, the commercials promised, would emerge in Barcelona. But Dan O'Brien had a terrible day during the Olympic trials and failed to make the team. Sporting Goods Business Magazine's survey of industry retailers and manufacturers could locate only one respondent who knew Dan or Dave's last name, and when the would-be Reebok star, Dave Johnson, finally competed inside Montjuic Stadium in Barcelona, he would wear Reebok shoes and official USA track and field clothing prominently supporting the Nike name and logo, as part of yet another multi-million-dollar sponsorship agreement. Everything had gone according to plan, but now, as Knight looked on with frustration, the great Satans of Reebok were getting millions of dollars of free publicity from the networks and newspapers, all of it generated by a 4-cent, 2-inch strip of cloth that said Reebok. But Reebok was only one of the big-time brand name combatants involved in the Olympic marketing firefight. Nike was also jostling for position on the global basketball stage with the aspiring global power brand known by the initials NBA. 3 days before the basketball finals, Harvey Schiller of the Olympic Committee met with Dave Gavitt of USA Basketball to discuss the Dream Team uniform impasse. The men emerged with a press release that proclaimed that while all members of the U.S. team must wear the Reebok-made uniforms, some players may choose to wear the award suit in a manner that does not reveal any commercial identification. However, in no instance will the uniform be defaced, Gavitt's statement decreed, or covered by any other material. Though it was Dave Gavitt who had demanded that Jordan and the others wear the outfits, he and other USA Basketball functionaries in Barcelona were extremely critical of intimations by Olympic officials that the Dream Teamers were greedy. Gavitt was being assisted in Barcelona by Russ Granick, the #2 USA Basketball executive, and the deputy commissioner of the NBA. As thousands of business-minded sports fans all over the world knew, when the Nike Dream Teamers and various USA Basketball officials squared off, USA Basketball was an NBA sub-brand for Olympic purposes, and the NBA and Nike had been warring over the profit potential of pro basketball and the control of certain players' services for a long time. The more than $800 million Nike basketball shoe business was around the same size as the NBA in terms of revenue. On a far more personal plane, the entrepreneurial wizard behind Nike, Phil Knight, and the entrepreneurial wizard behind the resuscitation of the National Basketball Association, 49-year-old former attorney David Stern, had for years been locked in what everyone in the sports and sports business worlds perceived as both an overt power struggle and an indirect contest over who would be known as the smartest sports business figure of them all. 8 years earlier, when David Stern became commissioner of the NBA, professional basketball was widely predicted to become the first major professional sport in America to simply close up shop. 17 of the 23 pro teams lost money in 1984, and the general image of the sport was overshadowed by player drug use, terrible labor relations, and an assumed absence of future marketability that was often attributed to the blackness of the urban game. But then David Stern turned pro basketball into what Knight and many others see as the best-run sport. Stern built new alliances with team owners and the NBA Players Association. Game attendance increased until tickets were hard to come by in almost every NBA town, and television viewership increased each year, in part because current Dream Teamers Larry Bird and Magic Johnson arrived to help in 1979, and Michael then soared onto the scene during the mid-1980s. During Jordan's first year, the Chicago Bulls franchise was valued at $18.7 million. 9 years later, it was worth $190 million. Pro basketball's revivification is historically analogous to the rebuilding of scandal-ridden and far too unsophisticated pro baseball between the world wars. A strong commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, employed public relations techniques to install the game as the national pastime, and the true meaning of baseball was successfully personified by the Michael Jordan of baseball, George Herman Babe Ruth. David Stern, like Knight, perceived sports as an unbreakable chronological and geographical continuum, as a highway broad and strong enough to carry thousands of saleable things. At some point, Stern had said during a speech to an American Marketing Association gathering before the Olympics, "The Cosby Show will stop, even in reruns, but I promise you the Boston Celtics will open the season." Though Stern got most of the general notice for the sudden hipness and success of pro basketball, many in the industry believed Knight and Nike had shown Stern how to turn the boys into icons fit for a sports-minded time. The best television teaser spots, starring Jordan and the others, did seem to replicate the vigor of Nike's famous commercials, and it was Nike that had most profitably demonstrated that once the new heroes were created, the things they wore and talked about would become desired by millions. Nike had been allied with Michael Jordan in battles with the league since the fall of 1984, when Stern had invoked a league uniformity of uniform clause to ban Jordan from wearing his new black and red Air Jordan shoes. Nike immediately fired back with the first Jordan commercial. The spot was shown in test markets, and it depicted the 20-year-old rookie as a glowering and dangerous presence for the last time. Jordan aggressively slammed a basketball from one hand to the other as a voice intoned. On October 15th, Nike created a revolutionary new basketball shoe. On October 18th, the NBA threw them out of the game. Fortunately, the NBA can't keep you from wearing them. By the end of the 1980s, the NBA had moved heavily into product marketing. Almost every Nike employee could by then recite the elements of sacrilege entailed in the way Jordan's face was being exploited by others. There was even a Jordan puppet beer can cooler. You bent back Michael's head, and it was for beer. and an absurd caricature of Jordan on the NBA Properties t-shirts. The 36-year-old Nike sports marketing director at the time, Fred Schreier, had moved to Beaverton, Oregon from Los Angeles, and a partnership in one of the big entertainment-oriented firms. In August of 1989, Schreier phoned Jordan's agent, David Falk, to point out that the NBA Players Agreement included a little-known clause by which players could formally opt out of the licensing program. When the collective bargaining agreement between players' representatives and the league had been struck, there was little thought about selling several $100 million worth of NBA goods, so the amount the players were making from the goods was minimal. 2 years after Falk had told the NBA of Jordan's desire to opt out, Jordan finally announced that he was taking back his face. He would transfer the rights to his likeness and name to the company that was so instrumental in making Michael Jordan universal. Several other players also opted out of the NBA licensing agreement and reclaimed their images, but Knight and his sports marketers believed that the only reason most NBA players didn't reclaim the rights to profit from their images was that those images were so poorly tended and protected by the army of sports agents, who, in Knight's estimation, seldom understood the complexity of marketable celebrity. By the NBA All-Star Game in 1992, Nike and the league were still going at it. A staff of 60 full-time marketing specialists now retailed NBA faces, names, logos, and gear, whereas a single individual had done so before Stern took the helm. Licensed NBA-sanctioned team jackets and shirts had become part of the omnibus youth uniform that began on the ground with Nike shoes, but Michael Jordan's face was missing from the caricature T-shirts retailed at the All-Star Game. If disappointed fans asked why, they were told that Nike was flexing its corporate muscles again. It had often come to Knight over the past few years that one of the only other people in the business who understood that marketing was the key to the health of a modern professional sport, and that agents had become inimical to the best interests of the game, was David Stern. Knight could often be heard to complain that the sports agents striking endorsement deals for athletes were mucking up the business. The agents came out of a time when someone making $100,000 was a well-paid athlete, he'd say. Agents were just fringe lawyers or guys with a huge passion for a sport, like Mark McCormick with golf. From those $100,000 NBA contracts, the agent got $4,000. But now you've got $120,000 agent fees for a single team contract, and for $1 million endorsement, the agent gets up to 20%. The incentive to fragment an image is huge, and when you split it up too often, nobody wins. Sports agents across the ethical spectrum suffered from an image problem not unlike personal injury lawyers. The word agent was often abjured in favor of athlete representative, or, since a large number of the 200 or so more prominent sports agents had gone to law school, lawyer. Even sports lawyer was invoked. David Falk, who was occasionally referred to among sports insiders as the agent from hell, often reminded writers and new acquaintances that Michael Jordan referred to him as his attorney. "It's a mark of respect," Falk would add. Knight was not in the least bit pleased to observe the way Falk had managed the progressive dilution of Michael Jordan's Nike-engendered public presence by the prominent additions to his portfolio, as Jordan called the agglomeration of Gatorade, Wheaties, Chevy, Hanes, and even a Ballpark Franks endorsement deal. Coca-Cola and McDonald's had had Jordan under contract before he was a superstar, but only Nike had invested the creative energy and financial resources required to create Air Jordan. By 1992, Knight believed that Michael Jordan was no longer, in sports marketing nomenclature, clean. It seemed that David Falk always had some angle to play when he broke the news of another deal. The CEO of one company was an old North Carolina Tar Heels guy. Michael wanted to do this deal because it's in Chicago, but Knight saw Jordan as manipulated and significantly devalued by association with underwear and hot dogs. Then came the evening when Knight stared at his television screen and watched Andre Agassi, a Nike guy since he was a 16-year-old wild kid whom no other company would touch, pumping Canon cameras. Andre tipped down his sunglasses, looked into the camera, and, with a knowing smirk, said, "Image is everything." Knight flipped. Agassi was particularly precocious in his understanding of the power of an image, but to go public with such an analysis was crazy. "This is a 180-degree turn away from our own imagery," Knight fumed. "Here we work like crazy to convey that performance, not the image, is everything. Andre wins more Grand Slams than Ivan Lendl at the same age, and yet everyone thinks he's a loser now because he lost 3 Grand Slams. How many did Lendl lose before he won 1? 6 or some damn thing. This image is everything is hurting him, and it's going to hurt us." So, before the Olympic summer began, a new control mechanism was created by Nike, and at the end of June the new system was publicly unveiled during the annual drafting of college basketball players by NBA teams. Shortly after Georgetown University's star center, Alonzo Mourning, was selected as the second draftee, a reporter asked Alonzo who he would be working for during the coming season, the young Charlotte Hornets team that had just drafted him, or Nike. "I work for Nike," Alonzo said. And the sports business grapevine coursed with news that Phil Knight was at it again. It turned out that Mourning, a young man whose glower often masked a handsome face and an infectious smile, and another young star, the leaping Mini-Michael from USC, Harold Miner, had signed revolutionary agreements in which Nike would pay them guaranteed sums, not just to endorse shoes and apparel, but also to play basketball. As part of Knight's desire to extend control, the new Nike Sports Management division, run by Fred Schreier, would manage Mourning's contract with the Hornets, his financial affairs, his public image, his ancillary marketing agreements, and even his charitable work. For all the notoriety Alonzo Mourning had accrued as a child basketball prodigy, as a high-profile college superstar playing for Nike coach John Thompson at Georgetown University, and as a surefire multi-million-dollar pro basketball draftee, as long as Alonzo could remember, he had perceived a business association with Nike as the means by which a gifted player would finally transcend the hardwood courts and the sports pages in a single bound. Now that he was with Nike, young Alonzo said in a dreamy, deep voice, "I'll be a household name." Knight never denied that the new management program was designed to increase Nike's control over a sports marketing system he believed the company had helped create and perfect. And though agents had the most to lose from Nike's sudden move into player management, David Stern realized that when the Nike players came to negotiate their new contracts, the balance of power would be substantially altered. Stern had come to Beaverton in late April 1991 to enlist Phil Knight's help in drafting the best of the pros to showcase the future World Game in Barcelona. Stern sat across a long conference table in a room near Knight's office atop the John McEnroe building. He personally assured Knight that despite a standing agreement that made Converse the official shoe of USA Basketball, the Dream Team stars would not be expected to wear cons in Barcelona. By mid-July, USA Basketball had already sold 23 licenses, granting the right to produce Dream Team shirts, watches, mugs, and other items. 13 corporations were on board as official sponsors, Nike being prominently absent from the list. But the medal stand outfits were not among the items sold off by USA Basketball. It turned out that other powerful marketing organizations were more central to the award suit impasse than Nike or the NBA. By far the most prominent brand symbol, as a fellow from the Gray Advertising Agency employed by the International Olympic Committee called it, on display in Barcelona were the 5 interlocking Olympic rings. 12 companies had paid $30 million each to be official Olympic sponsors. Nike passed. And others had paid at least $6 million to bolt the rings, as marketers said, to their products. At one point during the selling festival in Spain, A British athlete named Daley Thompson had trooped around the infield before a day of track and field competitions in a T-shirt that said, "This space for rent." Though Jordan held Gavitt and the league responsible for the Reebok warm-up snafu, it was actually a quirk of the Olympic brand marketing system that had led to the conflict. The United States Olympic Committee had showered all of the American athletes with thousands of dollars worth of sponsored goods, casual clothes, coats, rings, bags, cosmetics, and enough other stuff to fill a footlocker. But the only garment the athletes were required to wear by Olympic dictum was the award suit. The award suit, it turned out, was marketed not by the U.S. Olympic Committee, but by the much snootier and less easygoing International Olympic Committee, an assemblage of the sorts of aristocrats Nike people were taught to detest, and the American team's award suit had become commercial space bought and paid for by Reebok back in 1988. This is all about control. Knight fumed as the controversy persisted. For over a year, Knight had been spending time pondering his belief that Nike's future plans required an increased level of control. Knight was being constantly forced to acknowledge how much easier it had been when Nike was an entrepreneurial association of renegades. "We were the underdogs for so long there," he'd say. He talked about the importance of the global-scale Nike learning to fight a little less with the authorities and seeking to make peace with the leagues. And yet, if the Nike Inc. of 1992 had been a 20-year-old boy instead of a large commercial organization, a lingering authority problem would still have been a reasonable diagnosis, the residual penchant for irascible knee-jerk behavior and bloody-minded adventures being a legacy that was difficult for Nike's leaders to leave behind. Michael Jordan had every reason to believe that his associates at Nike would revel in the controversy he was perpetuating in Spain. Jordan had spent years observing that while Nike people on one hand proclaimed a corporate mission designed to protect those weighty values that allow athletics its pious references and high Puritan platitudes, they also subscribed to another equally essential aspect of the corporate ethos that elevated iconoclasts and individualistic athletes with big-time attitudes above any sport, governing body, league, or team. Nike executives loved athletes such as the combustible tennis players Eli Nastase and John McEnroe. The McEnroe some observers perceived as spoiled and immature was, in fact, an anti-elitist thorn in the side of an aristocratic tennis establishment from the Nike perspective. Mac was a fearless athlete who set new standards of intensity and the desire to win, as Knight phrased it, that still symbolized the fierce spirit of competitive drive referred to inside Nike as the company's special fire. A Nike athlete like the Atlanta pro football and baseball player Neon Deion Sanders, who sometimes jumped up and down on top of first base while the pitcher was trying to concentrate, and who did weird butt-twitching dances in the end zone, acted in a tradition harking back to Nike football player Lester Hayes, who reached inside opponents' helmets and slapped them in the face. Charles Barkley, who during the previous NBA season had called the city where he'd played, Philadelphia, racist, also behaved well within a bad boy with attitude Nike tradition. The kinds of athletes that embarrass grown-ups were entirely acceptable Nike guys. To be a Nike guy, you did not necessarily have to be sweet, squeaky clean, or even in nominal control of your mouth or your fists, but you did have to get it, as they say on the Nike World Campus, which can mean various things not unconnected to a basic respect for Nike's heritage and a fervid unwillingness to lose. As Michael Jordan knew well, the Nike heritage included an attitude and a taste for a good fight. Nike's annual report issued that summer, a document of a tradition as bland as a phone book, all but dripped with their corporate attitude. It presented profit and loss graphs as murky expressionist paintings. The text mocked conventional wisdom. Knight often ironically used the phrase conventional wisdom, invariably noting that he considered the phrase an oxymoron, in light of the recent triumphs of various Nike athletes, No one will ever break Bob Beeman's long jump record at sea level. Andre Agassi can't win on grass. Nolan Ryan is too old. A black man can never be a good company spokesman in white America. The rest of the world has caught up with the USA in basketball. But recently Knight had observed that each time Nike ventured out to protect its lead, the corporate imperatives, rangy company traditions, and the popularly perceived purities connected to sport all seemed to collide. There had even arisen during the recent years of the company's surging business performance and more palpable dominance of the sports industry, an identifiable constituency that hated Nike, not in the way rabid fans loathe the other team, but in the way people say they hate evil. At some point during the corporate rise corresponding to Michael Jordan's success curve, a discernible anti-Nike critique had emerged within the Nike-watching community. The Nike attitude, born so specifically of anti-establishment baby boom impulses, was portrayed as corporate arrogance, even as the empire-crumbling flaw of hubris by certain purists protective of the egalitarian superiority of amateur and non-commercial sports. Among the regular Nike critics were numerous sports writers, whose moral tone marked them now as latter-day Cromwells of the back pages. As so much entertainment, journalism had lost its critical edge and become integrated as part of the industry's publicity infrastructure. Some sports writers had maintained a critical perspective predicated on the belief that sports and business should remain as separate as church and state. The members of the small coterie of crusading sports writers that offered Nike as an example of what was wrong with sport did not question the morality or the artistic disadvantages of professionalizing violin playing or painting, but the enmeshing of sports and commercial culture inspired moral outrage, especially in light of the clearly persuasive force the combination was capable of generating on human will. But the thing that was so unsettling about the phone calls coming into Nike headquarters during the Olympics was that most of the callers were Nike customers who seemed this time to have bought the anti-Nike line. It's as if we've become a discrete set of values for our consumers. Nike's chief of public perception, Liz Dolan, complained after Barcelona. Tens of thousands of brand loyalists had called Nike to say that ads or shoes or even inspired posters had changed their lives. Letters circulated in Beaverton from citizens claiming that they finally left abusive husbands or even achieved heroic rescues from burning buildings, just because Nike had injected "just do it" into the zeitgeist. But because we're connected to sports, Dolan complained, our success is perceived as something bad. If a computer company in Silicon Valley grew so quickly that profits had doubled by the year and had delivered buckets of money to shareholders, the public would be thrilled. But for us, it's different. Everybody loves success, McEnroe once scoffed, but they hate successful people. We were the up-and-comers once, and everybody liked us, Knight observed after the Olympics ended. Then we became number one, and everybody started shooting. It's not just because of our connection to sports. It's also because there's a flip side to all the emotion we generate and the tremendous well of emotions we live off of. Somehow, emotions imply their opposites, and at the level we operate, that reaction is much more than a passing thought. The emotion made possible the progression from company ethos to sports, to individual athletes, to customer creation. The emotion was woven deeply into everything about Knight's aspirations, and the emotion was laced into Nike's special vision of corporate organization, the requirement of constant internal change, the fierce view of competition, the marketing philosophy, the ads, and the products. It was the emotion, the Nike spirit, the composition and maintenance of which so many outside the company regarded as a trade secret, that had made objects bearing the Nike logo on the heel or breast pockets such universal objects of desire. And that emotion was what the competition feared, what they found almost impossible to replicate, and so it was one of the things they mocked and derided. Nike was the cult. Nike was the company that wanted to subordinate the best of sport to profit. Knight's global sports marketing efforts gave rise to fears that Nike would never stop until it had vertically integrated all of sports, until it controlled all the games. After Nike players, there would be Nike teams and Nike leagues and even Nike sports. They'll make them up, one competitor contended, like in that movie, Rollerball. By the end of the Barcelona summer, Knight realized that Nike was fast becoming a lightning rod for all of the popular ambivalence about the general convergence of American business and American sports. Nike stood in for all the encroaching uneasiness over the way sports had come to so preoccupy public consciousness and discourse. The backlash emanated from a lasting intellectual distrust of sports, still characterized by T.S. Eliot's famous decrying of the decadent athleticism of American culture, and the critique drew force from both the Victorian view of sport as an avoidance of sober virtue, and from the radical view of sport as a barbiturate, capable of clouding the fervor of the people and making them item-starved and bargain-hungry. Knight worried about the way momentary setbacks requiring moral reconsideration were coming on faster and more furiously all the time. He had looked on while Michael Jordan took a lot of heat after he chose to play golf and vacation with his family instead of going to meet President Bush at the White House after the Bulls won their first championship in 1991. William Faulkner had refused an invitation to dine at the White House with John Kennedy because it was too far to go for dinner, and yet his reputation for intellectual and creative seriousness was only enhanced. But American sports heroes were Americans of another sort. Inventors fighting to protect their patents were individualists, bucking the bureaucratic status quo. But Jordan's decision to secede from the collected caricatures on the All-Star T-shirt was perceived as tantamount to an absence of patriotism. And still, during each month of the summer of 1992, hundreds of babies were given the first and middle names Michael Jordan. At a Nike press gala held in a huge and ornate Barcelona movie theater, it was a Japanese reporter who rose to ask, "Mr. Jordan, how does it feel to be God?" "Guess we can't lose now," Charles Barkley jibed from the side. Barkley was then asked what he saw when he looked at Michael Jordan. "Just a black, bald-headed millionaire," he replied. Jordan grinned his famous grin and deflected the God question. But over the months that followed Barcelona, Jordan would join Knight in wondering if, as Knight put it, the hype had finally gone too far. "Do I think Nike creates images for athletes that exceed their capacity to perform as athletes or as real people?" Knight was to muse after the Barcelona crisis finally passed. "Well, my short answer is yes, but it's not just us. It's TV that really defines these athletes. We just expand on the image. But perhaps our efforts do combine with the power of television to come together and create something that nobody can live up to." By the end of the summer, it had occurred to Phil Knight that perhaps the sheer force of Nike's image-making had created expectations capable of blindsiding the company. This was particular cause for concern because Knight, as all who know him will confirm, is a man who must always see what's coming at him. Howard White left the Nike encampment for the Ambassador Hotel off the main drag of Las Ramblas, where members of the Dream Team had been granted special permission to lodge away from the 15,000 other athletes occupying the Olympic Village. By mid-afternoon on the day of an 8 p.m. Dream Team appearance, the hotel was completely surrounded by thousands of onlookers, held back by hundreds of policemen, who waited to observe the American players simply traverse the sidewalk between the hotel entrance and a waiting bus. "It's like traveling with 12 rock stars," the Dream Team coach, Chuck Daly, complained later in the day. Festooned with a half-dozen necklaces, bearing various security passes and identification tags, Howard White waded through the crowd to Jordan after discussing the impending fiasco with Steve Miller and Liz Dolan. White tried to convey to his longtime friend that Knight thought this time it might be wise to pull back, to just go ahead and wear the Reebok Awards ceremony garb on Sunday. "Well, then I guess Phil doesn't realize how loyal I really am," Jordan replied, frowning. "What's happening here?" Jordan inquired, staring at Howard White, who used to check out the women who flocked to Jordan during his rookie year, trying to discern potential gold diggers. "Isn't Phil going to back me up on this?" As reports appeared in a Salt Lake City newspaper quoting LA Gear endorser Karl Malone and Nike's John Stockton, "In a million years there's no way I'm not going up there," as disagreeing with the hardline point of view, Howard White called Knight. "M wants to know why we're not backing him on this," White said. He seemed disappointed. "You know, Michael, it's that ultimate warrior stuff. Shit's black or shit's white. There's no gray at all. He says the NBA hired him, like a gunfighter, and they should have known that there were limits to what he'd do." International news wires carried reports that NBA Commissioner David Stern had criticized comments about the Dream Team made by Mike Moran of the United States Olympic Committee, who was described on the wire as a low-level public relations official. Stern said that Moran had issued an ultimatum and our guys didn't like it, so they decided to have some fun with it. "Our players always intended to come here, represent their country, win the gold medal, and represent the U.S. at the medal ceremonies." Not long before the final game on August 8th, Michael Jordan read a somewhat legalistic-sounding memo from Knight that affirmed Nike's position that wearing the prescribed medal stand uniform would not violate the Nike athletes' contractual agreements. Jordan knew that he was about to play a basketball game in which he was not Jordan of Chicago or even Jordan of the NBA. He was the greatest of all the global gunfighters in a world at comparative peace. He was Jordan of the great big marketplace to come in Barcelona, and to be forced to pretend otherwise amid the elaborate jockeying for strategic position that was the Olympics of 1992, as Howard White conveyed to his boss, made Michael Jordan plenty pissed. In Barcelona, a ticket to the basketball awards ceremony had by now become the standard reference to the increasingly expensive and hard-to-come-by ticket to the final game. The Dream Team members gathered once more before leaving the hotel to finally decide what was to be done. Though Gavitt's statement had prescribed covering the medals uniform, Jordan now argued for taping over the Reebok tabs on the jacket and pants. Magic Johnson was strongly supportive of Jordan's view, even though he'd become fed up with his own shoe endorsement company, Converse, because they'd failed to help him step up into the light, as Nike had done for Michael and Charles. While Michael Jordan's son, Jeffrey, played one-on-one against John Stockton's son on the miniature basketball court set up inside the players' lounge in the hotel, some members of the team argued that Gavitt's reference to wearing the awards suit in a manner that does not reveal any commercial identification was best addressed by rolling the collars of the jackets back until the Reebok emblem was obscured. "Let's get some safety pins," someone said. "Don't you think things have gone too far to back away?" Jordan asked David Falk. "The point is to make your statement," Falk said. "I think there's a better way to do this." As the music blared on the loudspeaker system in the arena, the roaring crowd greeted the smiling and waving Croatian team the American squad had just beaten by 32 points. Then, to rising cheers, Magic Johnson led the Dream Team onto the floor. Johnson had joined the others in rolling back the collars of their red, white, and blue jackets and pinning them near the shoulders. The huge V created on the players' chests and the bulkiness of the rolled collar were reminiscent of the way motorcycle riders wore their leather jackets in the earliest biker films. If any of the hundreds of millions of people tuning in bothered to get up close to the screen and squint, as the leaders of Reebok were undoubtedly doing in and around Stoughton, Massachusetts, they could just about make out a Reebok patch visible on most of the players' pants. "I never viewed the incident as a businessman," Reebok CEO Paul Fireman would later claim. "I looked at it as an American, as someone seeing another level of societal breakdown, greed and personal desires, being chosen over the patriotic and global values we ought to have." From the start, NBC announcer Marv Albert intoned, they called them the Dream Team. Magic Johnson had come out waving an American flag above his head. But now that Michael Jordan had appeared, looking serious and blowing bubbles with his chewing gum, The crowd could see that he and then Charles Barkley had carefully arranged American flags around their necks and secured them with safety pins so as to cover even the little Reebok emblem on their pants. Barkley stood atop the stand just a few feet away from Karl Malone of the Utah Jazz. If Charles was indeed the most celebrated power forward playing the game, then Malone matched or possibly even exceeded Barkley in the realm of pure talent. And yet Malone could still walk down a crowded street and pass unnoticed by children and football fans. There were no Karl Malone simulated bald-pate skull caps on the market, and Malone could not be found cavorting with dancing girls or battling Godzilla in outrageous tongue-in-cheek commercials, like those that had made Barkley famous in places where the annual per capita income barely exceeded the cost of a pair of Nike shoes. Charles certainly had a ready-for-media face and a late-night talk show mouth, but the projection of his image was a function of the shoes he wore. Karl Malone had the talent to be a hero of Nike proportions, but he'd signed with another company. Barkley threw kisses from the stand, and eventually even Michael Jordan began to grin. Jordan stood between Scottie Pippen and Clyde Drexler, with Old Glory over one shoulder. The flag concept was apparently David Falk's contribution, but the idea was suggested so close to game time that only 3 flags could be found. Jordan later said he figured nobody would question the patriotism of a man literally draped in the flag. But people did. Letters complaining that wearing a flag was un-American arrived at both the Nike and U.S. Olympic Committee headquarters. Citizens who seemed unaware of the logo battle that had preceded the medal ceremony were offended by the flag being turned into clothing and associated with a mere game. Dave Gavitt was philosophical as the incident at Barcelona finally passed into sports hype history. Michael was nothing but a superstar through the whole thing, Gavitt said, and Phil Knight did everything he could to help. But you've got to say one thing about those guys at Nike. Like 'em or not, they marched to the beat of a very separate drummer. It was never quite clear which members of the Dream Team went home without their Olympic award suits, but maintenance personnel cleaning up the arena on the final day of the 1992 Games reported that several red, white, and blue jackets with USA on the front and matching blue warm-up pants had been found between some benches on the locker room floor. Beaverton, 2. April 1993. Poised atop a tall stool in the middle of his colorful enclosure in the Jordan Building, 32-year-old Nike designer Bill Worthington held his latest invention high in the air before him, staring hard at the object in his hand as he spoke. It took nearly 7 months to occur, he said in his even, somewhat affectless voice. It took a lot of screaming and yelling and team building inside the Matrix. It took a lot of refusing to give up. I worked hard to build alliances and to counter internal skepticism over whether the consumer would be able to appreciate the technology inside this shoe or understand its personality. This shoe, Bill continued on a breezy morning, soliloquizing to the prototype held at eye level, is like an animal. It's like a living, breathing thing, instead of an inanimate consumer product. I'd already played around with a shoe inspired by dinosaurs before this came together. Dinosaurs are very cool. I imagined a shoe called the Aerodactyl, but then I came up with this. He was still speaking to the shoe. The Air Carnivore. Deep, snaking grooves subdivided the complicated black and purple topography on the bottom of Worthington's shoe, cleaving the sole into separate pods. The pod concept came up from the techies down in Nike Labs, as did the purple, black, and silver Velcro anti-inversion strapping device, running vertically along the outside of the shoe, which was designed to help athletes and non-athletes resist turning their ankles inward while in the air, and so to avoid breaking bones or straining ligaments if they hit the court or pavement on the outside edge of their feet. Another adjustable strap enclosed the anti-inversion support collar that braceleted the ankle, and Bill demonstrated a third strap, this one a huge Velcro fastener over the top of the foot, designed to obviate the need for shoelaces. He caressed a high-rebound Phylon midsole, ringed by a black-and-white zebra print pattern, and he palpitated the dynamic fit sleeve, or Huarache fit system, as it's also known, that employed the spongy neoprene lycra spandex material, out of which Gordon Thompson had once made his noxious purple room. Several arrangements of advanced designer polymers, variously rock-hard, malleable, breathable, or high-memory substances, designers have borrowed from chemists, NASA scientists, sailmakers, and women's girdles, or cooked up themselves, were glued or sewn to the oxidized green, black, gray, and purple shoe. The green upper, the soft outer foot covering of the Air Carnivore, was made of a lightweight, leatheroid Nike material called Durabuck, which was cooked up when the lab guys made a prototype Nike bat boot for actor Michael Keaton to wear in the movie Batman, and which is now made for Nike in Japan by the world's best component makers. Worthington, a former Los Angeles-based industrial design student and current holder of one of the most coveted of all design job titles, continued to slowly rotate in his hand the strange and rather beautiful object he'd wrought. As it turned, the Air Carnivore appeared to be leaning forward into the wind, like an object that was indeed, as its creator contended now, without irony, just a heartbeat shy of being alive. All around Worthington's work cubicle were images and storyboards that had helped inspire his new shoe. There were photographs from movies, notably from the Alien series, some of them depicting various creatures sucking away people's faces. One storyboard displayed a cartoon character Worthington had created to help him sell the image and market position of the shoe inside the combination organizational format, marketing mechanism, and cultural labyrinth known as the Nike Matrix. Worthington pointed to his drawing of a wild-eyed young man. Bert Starkweather here is an average kid, until Air Carnivores transform his personality. In the shoes, he becomes the anti-superhero Bolt Stingwater, who wins drag races on foot and steps on people's faces. Worthington pulled out a wanted poster on which the dangerous Stingwater was accused of terrorizing slow-moving salad bar patrons, destroying basketball rims, and mocking L.A. Gear executives. Like most of the shoe designers who work for Nike, Bill Worthington accepts the occasional classification of his creative cohorts as Nike's cultural pirates. The designers tend to watch more non-sports TV than the others and read more non-sports magazines in search of ideas. Most of them spend weeks on the road, hanging out at playgrounds, at professional team practices, and, of course, at hundreds of regional malls. Gordon Thompson even likes to watch people in museums when he's in need of a creative kick. Though the Air Carnivore was inspired by nature and to some extent related to a shoe that Tinker Hatfield had worked up for the people running around inside some of the dinosaur get-ups in Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park, Tinker called those shoes Air Dinos and had since encouraged an animalistic design motif. Worthington admitted that his new shoe, due to debut in stores during the coming August, had drawn its distinctive attitude and attendant Bert Starkweather Bolt Stingwater character from the real-life Nike Eakin and former hockey pro, Duke Stump. Worthington had gone to visit Stump in Southern California for 5 days in search of some culture to pirate. They stayed at Duke's place in Manhattan Beach and went surfing. Worthington noted Duke's ability to become extremely serious and competitive around his sports. He seemed to change into someone else. Worthington was inspired by Duke and even drew pleasure from the simple, staccato pronunciation of the young Eakin's name, Duke Stump. People often inspired Nike shoes. The Air Diamond Turfs were meant to replicate Dion's fashion sense, and Tinker Hatfield had come up with the first high-tech cross-training shoe tethered to the marketing firestorm surrounding Bo Jackson, after considering Bo's hyperbolic cartoon of a strong man's form and deciding he should have a big, strong, cartoon-like shoe. The resulting shoe even had oversized fat bladders for tongues. As automobile styles have tended to replicate certain dominant modes of transportation over time, the Model T looked like a train, the heavily finned '57 Chevy like an imagined rocket ship of that time. Artifacts that captivate Nike designers have also turned into shoes. Tinker's fifth-generation Air Jordan was based on the P-51 Mustang fighter plane that seemed so romantic to the minds of a generation of boys raised on landmark books about the great fighter pilots of World War II. Not that boys old enough to remember the books were the prime consumers of the product. Hatfield also designed a Porsche-like shoe. If this shoe was a car, what would it be? To help others inside the Nike matrix understand the inspiration of his new Air Huaraches. I do see our shoes as unique and uniquely American contributions to contemporary design, Hatfield said from behind his drafting table in April. Adidas certainly pioneered the development of athletic footwear, but to this day they regard these shoes as equipment. They still don't understand how to go beyond that, and design and romance and imagery and all of those subliminal characteristics that make an object important to people in less utilitarian ways. Nike designers often point out that the standard issue that comes with their jobs includes a license to dream. The Nike designers who create the look of the 9,000 different units of apparel and 900 footwear items for sale at any given time work in partitioned layers that are mostly covered with drawings, strange postcards, old toys, prototype sports equipment, weird Arabic or Dutch shoes, lots of homemade signs, and a general ambiance of youthful, free associative creativity that is invariably tempered by some flavor of sophisticated wit. A huge print of the Rice-A-Roni box near one designer's desk had been refitted as a Rice and Ronnie pastiche, with images of Nike football players Jerry Rice and hard-hitting defensive back Ronnie Lott. The designers and various other creative types within the matrix have managed to so often wittily match new words with the utterly Nikeized noun air, arrivederci, air conditioner, air apparent, air assault, the list goes on for pages, that former talk show producer Mike Doherty has observed that the near-daily repetition of the task reminds him of the trick of thinking up new questions for Merv Griffin to ask his perennial guest, Zsa Zsa Gabor. Because a shoe like the Carnivore must begin to wend its way through the creation process 15 months before it appears in stores, Nike employs special consulting organizations based in Europe and Hong Kong to help them predict changeable consumer color tastes. The color gurus assess certain advanced high-fashion trends, and they even look into coming automotive color trends to foretell the in-hues of seasons to come. But Gordon Thompson and the other keepers of the official Nike palette distributed each season mix the consultants' intelligence with their own observations made in locker rooms and gyms. Though the technological projection of global imagery was homogenizing certain consumer preferences, especially among teenagers around the world, there were still regional predilections toward certain colors. There had been jubilation inside the marketing camps at Nike when it was learned through the Asian factory grapevine that the Reebok Shack Attack shoe, due to appear in stores in just a few weeks, would be mostly white. Nike trackers were quite sure that the urban preference of the season, especially in the American Northeast, would be black. Despite the statement made by the bright color of the Air Carnivore, The paramount enticement of the shoe was still its fully loaded technological package. As with many of the newest top-of-the-line models, the Carnivore incorporated recent developments passed along to the design teams from the Nike Sports Research Lab and the Advanced Product Engineering Group. The pod structure of the sole was based on lab work, indicating that the forefoot and heel of the human foot actually have separate tasks and tendencies when called upon to perform athletic movements. A design that treated the foot as separate quadrants, or pods, the research showed, might allow the 26 bones, 3 arches, and innumerable ligaments and muscles inside the foot to perform more naturally. The anti-inversion strap was based on data showing that almost all ankle injuries suffered while playing basketball were inversion-type sprains. The data led to Nike lab tests that required stalwart subjects to strap their feet into shoes glued to stainless steel slabs inside the Nike Sports Research Lab. The slabs were connected to various ominous-looking steel gears and gauges, and to an electric power source capable of pronating, inverting, and generally twisting a foot and ankle, well beyond levels of simple pain, though test subjects reported no lasting effects from the experimental tortures. The Sports Research Lab on the ground floor of the Jordan Building is dominated by a large open space filled with lots of computers on trolleys, automatic treadmills built into the floor, exercise bikes, closed-circuit camera systems pointing at the treadmills and bikes, a full-sized human skeleton of the sort occasionally discovered inside closets during bad movies, assorted weight plates, and piled boxes of shoes made by Reebok and Asics, as well as by Nike. One of the many Victorian-looking machines in the lab is designed to rub the outsole, or very bottom, of a shoe for hours on end across surfaces that simulate clay tennis courts, wet boat decks made of teak, or the most porous of cement basketball courts. Another machine calls for test subjects to run without shoes across a steel pressure mat that within seconds causes a nearby computer monitor to light up, with a color-coded map of the subject's foot, each hue representing a different pressure exerted upon distinct parts of the foot during landing. The easygoing head of the Nike Sports Research Lab, Tom McGurk, was a mechanical engineer who worked on a coring system designed to retrieve sediment from the floor of the Arctic Ocean before he came to Nike. McGurk's lab, with its 12 biomechanical and physiological research specialists, was set up in 1980 when external support for sports medicine research projects was pulled inside. The allied Nike Advanced Product Engineering Group, called APE inside the company, is more of a problem-solving unit than a leading-edge research group. When wearers of the first generation of all-purpose off-road style cross-trainers complained that the soles of the shoes wrapped around the pedals of their mountain bikes, APE technicians quickly came back with the Arrivederci, a shoe with a thermoplastic shank inside that will allow the sole to bend only one way. Our job here in sports research is to define human movement in terms of biomechanics and physiology, Tom McGurk said, his Nike passion comparatively sublimated by academic reserve. Our job is to translate activities into a set of performance-enhancing and injury-reducing needs. And we do a lot of work to improve end-user perception. The Carnivore, for example, has only limited ability to physically prevent the ankle from turning in, but it will telegraph information to the user that will help him or her resist turning the ankle while in the air. Because of the constant flow of data sent up from the Nike labs, Nike designers know that Michael Jordan ran about 2.5 miles during a typical basketball game, and that he landed after an average leap at a peak force 3 times his body weight. After a test conducted at the University of Delaware, the techies learned that Charles Barkley, because of his size, jumping ability, and landing style, came down with a force 7 times greater than his weight. The technicians know that the average professional soccer player runs more than 10 kilometers during a match in his cleated shoes. And after many visits to the lab by John McEnroe, Jimmy Connors, Mary Jo Fernandez, and other tennis players, the specialists studying the habit of so many players who drag their toes while serving were able to develop a material that can be placed against an abrasion wheel for 3,000 cycles without wearing down. "We do stuff with materials that they're only thinking about putting in the space shuttle," said Henry Criss, a one-time pro football prospect who became a Nike chemist and then director of the Nike Environmental Action Team that is at work on a green, completely recycled shoe. "There's some very serious polymer science being practiced around here," Henry said. In a few weeks, when everything was totted up, it would turn out that Nike had spent some $22.6 million on research, product development, and product testing during the previous 12 months. Non-technical Nike executives seemed to enter the world of product research in the Jordan building with the bemused respect of James Bond being outfitted at headquarters by the ever-humorless Q. Wearing what-will-they-think-of-next looks, they walk around the measuring equipment, huge shoe mills, and blocks of steel, where test molds, customized shoes for college and professional athletes, and the all-important samples for the factories in Asia are made. "We put so much into the technical side because you can't create an emotional tie to a bad product," Knight often says. "It's just not honest. People will eventually find out if you try to sell them a dishonest product." Knight seemed pleased by a new full-page color ad running in spring issues of various national magazines. A pair of $120 Nike Air Max running shoes sat in front of a $70,000 Range Rover, the Rolls-Royce of the utility vehicles now in vogue. "Now there's an air suspension system for every size budget," read the ad copy, which then descended to smaller print, boasting that the very same technology that created a revolution in running shoes was finally available in a serious car. Little-ribbed, amber-colored Nike Air gas bags are visible on desktops all over the Beaverton campus. Brown cardboard boxes full of the famous bags lie open in corners all over the Jordan building, and passers-by can occasionally be seen to grab the bags and squeeze the firm little breakthroughs like state-of-the-art worry beads. The material used to form the airbags is manufactured by a Missouri firm called Tetra, one of only 3 smaller companies that Knight has acquired, along with the dress shoe manufacturer Cole Haan, purchased in 1988, and a small Southern California sports hat maker called Sports Specialty, purchased in January 1993. The bags and even the gas inside were invented by a fellow named Frank Rudy, a former aerospace engineer who first took his gas cushioning idea to Adidas and was turned away. Rudy is said to record each and every one of his thoughts and his interactions with others in a journal. So obsessed has the extremely wealthy inventor become with somebody ripping off his inventions. If Rudy is coming to the campus, Nike lab and design employees know to mark off several extra hours in the little Nike Filofax-style just-do-it appointment calendars everyone carries around, because Frank always has a lot to say. When Rudy arrived with his rough, air-cushioned shoes in 1977, Knight was still taking very long daily runs. He set out in one of the prototypes and was amazed by the ride the cushioning offered. Rudy and Nike's early Air Sole technology was first built into a running shoe in 1979, and the bags were laid into a basketball and tennis shoe 3 years later. But the cushioning innovation was buried inside Nike's shoes for years, and the customers didn't really seem to care. The invention was available while millions of Americans subjected their aging joints and tortured ligament encapsulations to high-impact jumping up and down in those flimsy Reebok freestyles during the early 1980s. The elevated spirit of Nike innovation was for some reason being left behind on computer screens and workbenches. The emotional power that inspired the products, all that romance, Nike heritage, and the swelling fantasies of authentic athletic possibility, was hidden inside the separate society of a company that seemed to have lost touch with the way people outside their world thought and felt and acted when it came time to buy a new pair of shoes. Famous Nike athletes were everywhere on fields and courts, excelling in the carefully made products, but that didn't seem to be enough to grow the business. "We were in complete disarray," Knight recalls. "We had gone from never having an unprofitable quarter to having two back-to-back unprofitable quarters. We were just so naive. We had simply lost our way." After the first round of layoffs in 1986, with the stock price falling under $10, Knight had got up in a Portland warehouse to convene a meeting of all the employees. "Well," he said, without a hint of pleasure or pride, "we just crossed $1 billion in sales. But I have to tell you that I would rather be the president of a great $500 million sports and fitness company than the head of a badly run billion-dollar sneaker company." Knight seemed to have it in mind to stop being a shoe company. Nike had to be reconceived as something else, something more inspiring. Nike still dominated the running shoe market at the time, but that market was shrinking as the running boom continued to fade. The new Air Jordan line had opened with a bang, but it was suddenly slumping badly in 1986. In part because Michael Jordan had broken his foot early in the season and would miss 64 games. Old Converse seemed to be coming back from the dead and was cutting into Nike's sales, and Nike shoes were still relatively invisible in health clubs and on the aerobic dance scene. The designers were laboring to address the latest fitness vogue, cross-training, based on the theory that participation in a variety of sports and exercises would enhance performance and lower the incidence of injury. Tinker Hatfield was working on a cross-training shoe that would wed enough air cushioning to allow someone to run a few miles in safety and comfort, with enough structural support to also allow the quick lateral movements required by tennis or basketball. The idea of an all-purpose shoe that crossed dedicated sports boundaries harked back to research Tom Clark had conducted when the Nike lab was still located in Exeter, New Hampshire. In the fall of 1986, John McEnroe played in the Volvo tennis tournament in Los Angeles in a grayish, relatively high-sided shoe with a big strap across the top. Tinker Hatfield called his latest invention the Air Cross Trainer, and customers immediately began to come into stores to ask about the unusual new tennis shoe they'd seen John McEnroe wearing on TV. They were told that the shoes weren't tennis shoes. They were cross trainers, but as with too many Nike innovations on behalf of athletes, the shoes failed to take on a more graspable public meaning out there beyond Nike, in the real world. "You know, I've been thinking about these next cross-trainers you want to move out next year," a young ad copywriter named Jim Riswold mentioned to Tinker Hatfield during a meeting in mid-1987. "If you're thinking about hooking the shoes up with a guy, this Bo Jackson kid's a natural." Jim Riswold was 30 at the time, and his friends and colleagues often claimed that they were still waiting for Jim to turn 13. Riswold's house in Portland was cluttered with a collection of toys and various other artifacts connected to Warner Brothers and his childhood hero, Bugs Bunny. Riswold was also a bona fide sports nut in the manner of a somewhat hyperactive adolescent boy. One of his earliest memories was the sight of another boyhood hero, Mickey Mantle, actually weeping on television because he wanted his gelatinous breakfast cereal, called Mapo. Firmly committed to protracting the experiences of a boy's life, Riswold managed to remain an undergraduate at the University of Washington for some 7 years. He received a bachelor's degree in history before chickening out on the idea of law school. Then he went back for another BA in philosophy, because he wanted to go on to advanced graduate research on the work of certain 19th-century German philosophers. But after graduation, when Griswold discovered that his inability to read or speak German might seriously impede this particular career route, he went back to college again for a third BA, this one in communications. In 1979, Griswold had a part-time job working for the Seattle Supersonics basketball team, which led to a full-time job with the Seattle ad firm the Sonics employed. Griswold figured he'd stick with advertising until he figured out what he really wanted to study during his next pass through school. But then he heard about a tiny ad agency in Portland that was looking for a writer. Griswold submitted his resume and soon moved to Oregon to work for Wieden and Kennedy. He thinks he was the 6th employee of the agency. Advertising was always a touchy subject inside Nike because Knight was known to believe that the whole process was phony. Athletes were the real ticket. Real athletes in authentic shoes would draw the public to the goods because of the honesty of the process. Bowerman still referred to advertising and marketing with the turn-of-the-century term salesmanship, which he uttered contemptuously. In 1986, Nike job applicants were warned that if they ended up being interviewed by Knight, they should omit the words advertising and marketing from their conversation. Nike began to place a bit of its advertising business with Dan Wieden and David Kennedy's company in 1980. Knight's first words to Dan Wieden when they met were, "I'm Phil Knight, and I hate advertising." But by the late 1980s, the relationship of Nike and the by then much decorated and annually awarded ad shop in Portland was the stuff of Madison Avenue legend. Nike had actually transferred its national advertising business to the much larger Chiat Day agency in 1983. A Chiat Day creative team had created the first Air Jordan commercial. But by 1986, Nike and W&K were again a team, and soon thereafter the Wieden and Kennedy offices in Portland sported a basketball court replete with bleachers. The Nike model, or anti-model, became the basis of the philosophical and managerial culture of the ad agency, and helped Nike out of a period of decline, doubt, and introversion by gleaning what was noble and cool about the tribal Nike style and worldview, and then packaging their temperament and sports lust as television commercials, magazine ads, and billboards. The customers, with W&K's help, would finally understand that Nike meant something more than shoes. Around the time Jim Griswold mentioned his fascination with the multi-talented kid named Bo, a new class of air-cushioned shoes were ready to debut. Tinker Hatfield and Mark Parker had been wondering if perhaps the customers would become more excited about the air technology if they built them a little window in the side of the heel through which to actually see the gas. After discussions with Wieden and Kennedy staffers, it was agreed that Tinker's new Air Max running shoe could be a way to resubmit the airbags to the public. The new shoe would be cast as the technical revolution it really had been, back when Frank Rudy showed up years earlier. And the shoe would be portrayed as indicative of a much larger revolution now at hand. Knight was now saying that perhaps the running boom had been only the advance wave of a much larger health and fitness revolution to which Nike had never attached itself in a fundamental way. Many members of the generation that came of age to the sound of the Beatles song Revolution were shocked and offended by the co-optation of that sacred piece of post-war culture to the cause of selling shoes, but few Americans also failed to see or hear the new commercials. A lawsuit on behalf of the Beatles increased publicity for the ad, and after the initial shock, the artful juxtaposition of black and white film showing non-famous people swimming, biking, and weightlifting, with shots of Michael Jordan and John McEnroe in the cross-trainers he now wore during every tennis match, doing their respective sporting things, seemed to captivate viewers and project an attitude that was absent from other TV ads. The message seemed designed to diminish the distance between the greatest athletes and people who play and exercise for fun. Though Nike dogma would have previously precluded the potential muddying of a great athlete's image, the carefully contrived commercial ennobled every kid, pro-athlete, and duffer who appeared. With the Beatles in the background, the commercial was like a 90-second celebration. And the new shoes moved out of the stores. Shortly after the Revolution commercials aired, Jim Riswold's boss, Dan Wyden, was giving a presentation to advertising director Scott Bedbury and the other managers on Nike's ad board. Wyden spoke of a generalized strain of guilt shared by Americans who had let health and fitness issues slide, or had managed to so complicate their lives that exercise and health had never become part of their routines. Wyden said Nike ought to address the powerful sense of ennui he perceived in the culture. He said that the Revolution spots showed that the right ads could get people out of their chairs and into the shoes. What we need to convey, Wyden said, is just go ahead, just fuck it. But the card that came up on the projection screen displayed a different way to say the same thing. Everyone in the room looked at the words, "Just do it," and most of them were impressed. Riswold was finally assigned the job of creating a way to connect Bo Jackson, who would never actually play his sports in cross-trainers, with the new category of shoes. Riswold's first attempt was a photographic concept for billboards and walls that depicted the powerful bare-chested torso of the athlete, clad in football shoulder pads. Bo also held a baseball bat across the back of his neck, like a yoke. Bo had gotten married the day before the photo session, and a close examination of the billboards revealed the face of an endorsement athlete who would have preferred to be on his honeymoon. Bo Jackson had mellowed considerably since his days as a troubled and fatherless child in rural Alabama. He was so tough and fierce as a kid that he had been given a nickname derived from the local vernacular for wild boars. He was called Bo Hog for a while, and the name was eventually shortened to Bo. Jackson won the 1985 Heisman Trophy as a senior football player at Auburn. But Knight was less than pleased when he discovered that a Nike functionary had, without his approval, agreed to a $100,000 endorsement deal with some kid from Alabama who could have played high-profile pro football, but had opted instead for a backwater minor league baseball career. But a year later, Jackson was playing Major League Baseball with the Kansas City Royals, and he'd committed to playing at least part of the next football season with the Los Angeles Raiders. Riswold wrote a series of commercials that featured Bo exercising like crazy, which Bo really did every single day. He rode a bike like a madman in one, and worked out furiously in another. Here, the commercials clearly implied, was the ultimate cross-training athlete. Bo was ready for anything. He was intense and hungry, as the sports cliches have it, and yet the commercials made from Riswold's scripts also conveyed a certain irony. The commercials hinted that Bo had been allowed to understand that his depiction approached perceived limits of mortal capacity. After pedaling the bike like a powerful machine for all but the last few seconds of one of the new commercials, Bo turned and asked with a pre-game determination, "Now, when is that Tour de France thing?" The ironies were complex and submerged. Bo was the omnibus athlete of ancient contests, but he was also the American John Henry, dwarfing his bike and ready to vanquish all comers. The ads were judged quite good inside Nike and Wyden and Kennedy, but everybody involved knew that the combination of the cross-training innovations and a Bo Jackson who played 2 professional sports could be made much bigger. And with Nike now drifting as the number 2 athletic shoe power, an explosive sort of success was all that would be accepted. They have to be woken up, Knight would say. What we need is a way to wake them up all over again. Jim Riswold had always believed that the unique selling proposition, the famous USP, which according to standard advertising and marketing practices, was that feature or design of a product that distinguished it from the competition, could, under carefully crafted circumstances, be a guy, or at least the image of a guy. But while plenty of baseball mitts had been sold over the years because the local Johnny Peskies of a particular time and place had signed their names in the pockets, the massive portion of the general public that a corporation of Nike's current size needed to address did not, as a whole, understand the heroic qualities of great athletes in the way Knight and Riswold did. The trick would be to find a way to cause an athlete to rise above the mire of sports platitudes, the ersatz homilies and the canned emotions that the public had come to expect. A new perspective on the sports hero would have to come through some kind of creative incongruity. In February of 1988, with the Beau on a Bike and other cross-training spots due to premiere that coming spring, Riswold was sitting in McCormick and Schmick's, a bar and restaurant on the corner of First and Oak, a few blocks from the Wyden and Kennedy offices. Nike and W&K personnel often retired to McCormick and Schmick's to cogitate together after meetings at the agency. "We've got to ignite the category," Nike VP of Marketing Tom Clark told Riswold. "Beau's going to be making the national highlight reels all the time. It's time for us to really light the fire." Riswold already knew that Nike was prepared to risk a significant portion of the company's total ad budget on an inspired cross-training campaign. "Yeah, thanks for reminding me," Riswold said to Clark, staring into his local beer. "Beau," he said, squinting with fatigue. "Beau, what?" It was almost 10 p.m. by then, and several rounds of beer had already come to the table. "Beau Brummel," somebody said. "Beau Derrick," said Nike ad director Scott Bedbury. "Beau Schembechler," added another, naming the football coach at the University of Michigan, a member of the ever-growing fraternity of Nike guys. "Beau Diddley," said Tom Clark. A brief discussion about the rock and roll performer ensued. Diddley was a godlike figure to many of the most famous British and American rock stars of the past 30 years, but the Chicago-based singer and guitar player had never risen to rock and roll stardom himself, in large part because he seemed to regard his songs and all of life in general as a somewhat bitter and usually dirty joke. Beau Diddley was one of those underappreciated American originals, a legend few Americans would be able to identify because he simply refused to be anything but himself. Beau Diddley's stories were told, and the names of his old songs were tossed back and forth for several minutes, until Jim Riswold suddenly said, "We have to change the subject, now." And everybody at the table knew Riswold had an idea. Later that same night, celebrating like crazy, Riswold backed the phrase "Beau knows" out of "Beau, you don't know diddly," the latter phrase having come to him back in the bar. As the commercial evolved in his mind, Riswold combined "Beau knows" with the cavalcade images of Nike stars hailing from different sports that had looked so good in the Revolution ads. Inside a 60-second commercial, the cross-training implications projected by Beau really knowing football and baseball could be overtly ironized through testimonials to his limitless powers from other Nike stars. Jordan could testify that Beau knew basketball. McEnroe could say that Beau knew tennis, too. Several years earlier, the sports marketers had signed ice hockey's reigning genius, Wayne Gretzky. It was thought Gretzky could help the Nike Canada division, and Knight often said it was imperative that an athlete statistically and visually more superior to his peers than even Jordan was turning out to be, better than other hockey players the way Hank Aaron was better than the rest in baseball, become part of the Nike team. Riswold figured that the Great One, recently moved into the American marketing spotlight, provided by his trade from Edmonton to the Los Angeles Kings, could contend that Beau knew hockey, too. A bunch of outsized weightlifters on Venice Beach would attest to Bo's knowledge. And finally, Bo Diddley himself would appear, with Bo Jackson in a Bo Diddley hat, wearing spandex workout pants and hacking at a guitar at the other Bo's legendary side. By now, Griswold was jumping up and down on his bed. The commercial was designed to open with the words "cross-training" by Bo Jackson set against a black background. The next shot would be another printed message, "Music by Bo Diddley," which would identify the soundtrack for those millions who couldn't remember the guitar riffs from the 1955 hit, "I'm a Man." The spot would be shot by the commercial director, Joe Pytka, whose powerful, if saccharine, Hallmark commercials belied Pytka's macho, often ranting, ponytailed presence. Pytka always traveled with a basketball and liked to take on all comers at one-on-one, especially the star athletes in some of his commercials. A huge man, much taller than Bo Jackson, Pytka would once scream at Bo for not charging close enough to the camera during the filming of one of the many commercials they would do together over the years. During the next take, Bo ran right directly over the director and his camera and sliced up Pytka's nose. The Bo and Bo part of the first Bo Knows spot was filmed in a nightclub near the Kansas City Royals spring training facility in Orlando, Florida. The other athletes were shot wherever they could be found. In Vero Beach, Florida, Pytka filmed L.A. Dodgers star Kirk Gibson saying "Bo knows." Griswold turned to Nike ad guy Scott Bedbury. "This is going to be the best fucking commercial you guys have ever done," he said. It was on the set with McEnroe that Griswold came up with the idea of McEnroe turning his "Bo knows tennis" proclamation into a question. And before Gretzky skated up to the camera, Griswold told Wayne to just stop, shake his head at the thought of Bo Jackson knowing one of the widest and most specialized sports of them all, and say, "No." By the time Bo Diddley was shown in the commercial, at first to tell the younger and far more heavily muscled Bo that he, in fact, knew diddly about music, and in the next shot, 6 months later, to admit that perhaps he did know diddly after all, the musician's ironic smile and laconic "I'm good but I really don't care" demeanor provided a near-perfect fillip to the compressed whirl of jarring cultural, artistic, athletic, personal, generational, racial, and ironic juxtapositions. Endorsed inside a minute by the most overtly talented athletes of the time, and begrudgingly accepted by one of the coolest of all the characters from the era when cool was born, Bo Jackson, who had not a single line in the commercial, was about to become, as Michael Jordan would later put it, a dream. And Nike was about to ride that dream into what was often referred to as an extended marketing orgasm that would continue for another 2 years. In June, the commercial was shown to 1,000 Nike sales reps in for a massive sales conclave in Beaverton, and they all jumped to their feet at once and applauded and cheered and whistled for 5 minutes after the last note of Bo Diddley's guitar was heard. Scott Bedbury went to Knight and proposed that it was time to take one of those old-fashioned Knight-like risks. Knight agreed to double the media investment in the Bo Knows spots from $6 million to $12 million, which was a lot of money for a company not making much money at the time. All running shoe advertising was put on hold, as was ad support for the burgeoning basketball category. No money would be spent on test groups or focus groups that might help measure the power of the commercial. All the money available in the entire back-to-school selling season would be hung on Bo. On the morning of the July 1989 baseball All-Star Game, a full-page ad in USA Today announced that Michael Jordan, John McEnroe, and Wayne Gretzky would all be joining Bo Jackson for the big game that night. A line on the bottom of the page said that anyone who missed the top of the 4th inning, when the Nike spot was scheduled to premiere, would be sorry. This, too, was something of a risk, because commercials during sporting events are often reshuffled, But more than that, promoting your ad instead of your athlete or your gear could easily be perceived as cocky, and that only if the ad was generally judged as particularly good. Bo hit a homer his first time at bat. The plane flew over the stadium with the Bo Knows sign. Smaller Bo Knows signs and Bo Knows hats were unveiled in the stands by Nike people spaced throughout the crowd. And then the commercial aired in the A spot, just as planned. Because of the big inning the American League team had just had, when the game recommenced, there was Bo again, standing at the plate. He singled to the right and went on to win the game's MVP award. God, Jim Reswold said as he watched everything fall into place from the stands, is a Bo Jackson fan. The commercial wasn't scheduled to run again for almost 3 weeks, time to kick off the back-to-school season, but it was shown close to 20 times during those weeks anyway. It appeared on evening news spots about Bo and his brilliant new commercial. It ran on the network morning talk shows and on Entertainment Tonight. The commercial immediately became the talk of the entertainment business, the ad world, and the sports scene. The wit and intelligence of the commercial was widely applauded by critics and various elite observers of popular culture. Nobody complained about Nike denigrating one aspect of popular culture by spiriting into another, just to sell shoes, as many had after the Revolution campaign, because most viewers who might have felt that way tended to believe that Bo Diddley had always deserved to be more famous, like so many of the lesser-known athletes whose visages Knight had ordered chiseled into the walls along the Walk of Fame. By the time all the critiques and news features were done, Scott Bedbury figured that Nike had received close to $20 million worth of free exposure. As soon as the selling of Bo's shoes began, Nike quickly dominated 80% of the new cross-training shoe market. Sales of the shoes rose from under $40 million after McEnroe strolled out on the court in his strange-looking grayish shoes to more than $400 million at the height of the Bo frenzy. And Bo Jackson, who made around 25 cents from every pair of top-of-the-line cross-trainers sold, became much richer by the day. Jackson was not the best football player or the best baseball player, and very few members of his new following would ever know that he tended to stutter painfully at times, or that he often growled at the sports reporters and columnists, who usually form the public perception of most athletes' personalities. In 1988, Bo had even alienated many serious football fans by describing football as a mere hobby, though he had distinguished himself that year as an NFL running back while playing only a half season with the Raiders. But the Bo Jackson of the Bo Knows commercials had transcended all of that. By early 1991, Bo Jackson was the second most famous athlete in the world. He owned by then an athlete influence rating of 4.22 to Michael Jordan's 4.46. The hip and irreverent intimations of Bo's athletic superpowers and his happy, self-effacing flailing at the electric guitar and knowing glances at the camera had conspired to make Bo real, or at least appear knowable in a way that famous people almost never are. Bo's image was full of warmth and cool and physical power. In 1988, Griswold's first campaign implied that Bo could do anything. By 1990, he simply knew. Compared to a more traditional product endorser, a monolithic white bread presence such as Bob Richards, the Ward Cleaver-esque prototypical letterman and Olympic hero of Wheaties box fame for much of the 1950s and 1960s, Bo was everything. A New Yorker cartoon claimed that Bo knows fiction. T-shirt one-liners appeared on boardwalks and beaches, promoting the arguably racist and clearly sexual expansion of the cultural assumption, Bo knows your sister. Bo had quickly transcended Kansas City and Oakland and gone national, and when the campaign was rolled across Europe, where soccer star Ian Rush and the cricket legend Ian Botham were inserted as Bo endorsers with a local flair, viewers in France and Italy who would never see Bo Jackson play or ever be able to describe the basic rules of his games, began to walk into stores to buy Nike cross trainers because they were the shoes preferred by Bo. By then, most Europeans also understood the English phrase, "just do it," and they knew about the company connected to the words. The first Just Do It ads in 1988 featuring the wheelchair racer Craig Blanchett, who was shown competing ferociously at racquetball and basketball before a shot of his chair was shown. Another starred Priscilla Welsh, the marathon champion, who had been a sedentary urbanite not long before winning the New York City Marathon at age 42. Another ad starred an 80-year-old runner named Walt Stack, who ran 17 miles a day up and down the streets of San Francisco. "Some people ask me how I can keep my teeth from chattering in the wintertime," Stack said during the commercial, puffing along. "I leave them in my locker." In 1989, very few commercials contained anything like a lingering silence during which a few words in simple type were shown against a black background and left unspoken. At first, the idea was intended to address all the rapid channel surfing and soundtrack muting that was being done by television watchers during commercials because commercials were so loud and unpleasant. But something about the starkness of the presentation of Just Do It was important to the phrase's elevation as a modern war whoop. Most members of the educated classes were closed to the suggestion that a television commercial, rather than a book or a brilliant doctrine, could actually change people's perception of themselves. A hot commercial might add a passing nuance or recognizable line, "Where's the beef?" being a famous case in point. But somehow Just Do It managed to evoke countless previously impeded visions of personal possibility. The phrase entered popular discourse like some consumer-age variation on the old revolutionary interrogative, "What is to be done?" Thousands of Americans felt moved to write letters or to call Nike, and millions of others began to loathe their own lassitude enough to buy a new pair of shoes and hit the road again or visit a gym. A Time magazine story about the baby boom generation would quote a social historian saying that the ethos of the largest American generation could be summed up in 3 words: just do it. Posters went up in health clubs and many workplaces. There are clubs you can't belong to, neighborhoods you can't live in, schools you can't get into, red text above a runner on a country road. But the roads are always open. Just do it. Just Do It said a T-shirt worn by students at the Ingham Okoboji Lutheran Bible Camp in northwestern Iowa. Live for Jesus. Just Do It read a blaring November 1992 headline in the New York Post, by which the newspaper referred to the democratic duty of casting a vote in the general election. The historical compression of Nike's earliest purposes and the subtle but massive selling mechanism of the phrase was so attractive that Scott Bedbury told Knight that Just Do It had to be protected from overuse. "We can't put it on pencils and keychains," he said. "This thing has become much more than an ad slogan. It's an idea. It's like a frame of mind." In 1991, after Nike had returned to the #1 slot in terms of sales, the American superhero Bo Jackson was very seriously injured on the football field. His dire medical prognosis inspired the Kansas City Royals to cut him from the team. During a meeting in Beaverton, Tom Clark told Knight, "I think we have to accept the fact that Bo's never coming back. Bo's going to be a lucky man if he's ever able to tie his own shoes." "I am going to be back. I'm going to play baseball again," Bo said to Phil Knight on the phone. "We're with you," Knight told him. By 1991, Nike also had several basketball superheroes on the payroll, alongside one superhero who transcended the term "the greatest player in the universe," as one tongue-in-cheek Griswold commercial proclaimed Air Jordan. During 1988 and 1989, Jim Griswold had written one commercial after another, writing 23 Nike commercials during one 12-month stretch. The Air Jordan line hummed along with sales of $200 million each year. Jordan showed himself capable of dominating almost any basketball game he played, and Griswold and his cohorts worked to twist and rotate his heroic athletics in ways that made Jordan come to life differently every few weeks. Griswold was enchanted by the character a little-known filmmaker named Spike Lee played in a film, She's Gotta Have It. So essential were Mars Blackmon's Air Jordans to his sense of identity that he refused to take the shoes off while making love. Griswold badgered his Nike contacts about hiring Spike Lee for months before they finally agreed to let Griswold begin his Spike and Mike series of ads. Jordan flashed goofy smiles and toyed with Lee's Blackmon character in some of the funniest commercials seen in years. Griswold and Wyden and Kennedy collected awards every time the award-conscious ad industry celebrated itself, as Michael Jordan felt himself disappearing into a world of other people's fantasies. One of the Spike and Mike spots didn't even show Jordan on the screen, but he was there and everywhere by then, and his technical absence allowed the commercial to circumvent an NCAA rule prohibiting the depiction of pro athletes during NCAA tournament broadcasts. Just before the reinvention process began at Nike, during the fall of 1987, Michael Jordan was on the verge of leaving Nike to form his own marketing company in association with Rob Strasser and designer Peter Moore. During the first of several extremely tense meetings held to discuss Jordan's future with the company, Jordan remembers Knight saying, "Michael Jordan without Nike won't mean anything," though Knight doesn't remember the conversation that way. Knight feels sure that Strasser was trying to manipulate Jordan and turn him against Nike at the time. Eventually, Jordan agreed to a 7-year contract with Nike that was designed to track the balance of his career. He would get $18 million as a guarantee over that time, though the annual guarantee would be far surpassed by his 5% royalty on the net wholesale price of every Air Jordan shoe. A $5 to $7 million per year 10-year total buyout of Jordan's marketing relationships was discussed and dropped, though it would have quickly played out in Nike's favor. Everyone was happy in the end except Strasser and Moore, and the powerful association of Jordan, Knight, and Nike resumed at full speed. The larger marketing strategy sustaining Air Jordan now involved creating a segment, a package that connected the shoes, colors, clothes, athlete, special Air Jordan logo, and other visual images, and the television advertising that would set the other elements of the marketing onslaught into motion. The Air Jordan basketball segment, or sub-brand, was eventually lined up beside the Air Force segment, shoes designed for players who hit the court hard, players like Charles Barkley and David Robinson. Griswold helped Robinson to become the cuddly, piano-playing Mr. Robinson in several successful commercials. The Air Flight segment, for which Jordan was originally signed on, and for which he continued to receive royalties despite the association of the shoes with other players, was now pegged to players who imagined themselves as deer-like leapers, those players who dreamed of flying across the lane like Scottie Pippen. By 1991, a visitor to any playground in the world could find hefty young Charles Barkleys and towering David Robinsons, playing Charles-style or Mr. Robinson-style in their Air Force shoes. Lean and aesthetic Scottie Pippens flew in Air Flights. Little Bo Jacksons pumped iron in thousands of gyms, and, by then, miniature Andre Agassiz lit up tennis courts in their peacock-colored Nike clothes and shoes. Sometimes I'd stuff my hair up into my hat and go to parks, and I'd see the kids pretending they were me, Agassi recalls. They'd be ripping balls into the far fence, pounding the balls over the fence, and I'd think, what have we done? During 1988, Reebok had launched a $25 million television campaign around the slogan, "You Be You," which was widely judged throughout the shoe, apparel, and advertising industries to be as much a complete flop as the Bo Knows, Air Jordan, and Just Do It campaigns were blowout successes. The Reebok endorser Miloslav Machir, the pro tennis player, was overheard at a match around the time of Reebok's last campaign at the top of the heap, asking, "Yes, but what this mean? I read it, you be you, but what it mean?" In 1954, a silhouette of a cowboy smoking a cigarette was just the outline of a cowboy smoking a cigarette. But 6 years later, after a historic blanketing of all available scenery with a specific set of visual images, that same silhouette meant Marlboro cigarettes to most Americans, and Marlboros, in turn, had become implicit of that romantic, lost possibility of individual expression, solitude, and freedom, the time when a man could really be a man. The modern cultural process, often called branding, bore only a passing connection to the searing of a proprietary mark on a perambulating steer. Marking a product is only part of an ostensibly American art and science that can transform brownish sugared water into a commonly desired fluid called Coke. The most powerful brands have, for several decades, employed marketing techniques to enhance products with some of the compelling characteristics of people. Well-marketed products become brave or sexy. For much of the post-World War II era, in particular since the late 1950s, the culture of marketing has had something of a civilizing effect on businesses, since a company centered on marketing worked to create customers. Profit became less an end in itself than the reward reaped from customers who were satisfied, the state of satisfaction being, according to orthodox theory, finding a balance among the 4 Ps: product development, price determination, place of distribution, and promotion. In some companies, marketing was subsumed in the management process, but in others, except during the 1980s, when company financiers had their moment out near the corporate footlights, the inspired marketers became the company's resident stars. The marketing and advertising specialists who serve the most powerful brands are quite often the most intellectually aggressive and culturally conversant members of a given business. Though descendants of American sellers of a rich vernacular tradition often connected to P.T. Barnum, they tend to be the company employees who read books. American marketers, in particular, have taken this original hybrid of economics, psychology, sociology, statistics, and a bit of old-fashioned tell you what I'm gonna do, and moved the discipline in the direction of some elevated Platonic ideal of marketing. Knight, who was featured in Harvard Business Review as something of a guru of state-of-the-art high-performance marketing during the Olympic summer of 1992, remains ambivalent about the characterization of Nike as the consummate marketing organization. Since 1990, when he became satisfied that Nike was no longer a shoe company, he'd always preferred sports company. "Marketing's just getting people to buy things," he said one evening by way of succinct definition. "One thing about bullshit," Bill Bowerman observed before a board meeting in 1993, "it's fertilizer, too." Bowerman is old enough, and Knight is entrepreneurial enough, to believe that in certain bedrock ways, true economic success is won by those who place something in the world that wasn't there before. The two men are sure that they have done that in creating Nike, but intimations of undue persuasion as part of the selling process make both men squirm. Sometimes Knight says he looks into the business environment modern marketing has made, where the gleaning of perspiration from certain country and western stars is sold as perfume, where one county's coroner division markets T-shirts bearing an image of the chalk line the police draw on the ground around murder victims, and he doesn't love what he sees. I think that the term marketing, just the processes of bringing resources to bear on selling something, isn't necessarily all that wonderful a thing, Knight said one afternoon in his empty conference room. The way I relate to marketing is as sociology. What Nike does well is interpret what people are doing, what they're interested in, and we've been lucky enough to align ourselves completely with what we perceive. In this day and age, the act of trying to sell somebody something they don't need is a wickedly difficult proposition. For us, marketing is building awareness around the products and reminding people what we do. Narrowly defined behavioral segmentation is not part of the Nike marketing process, though a calibrated psychographic view of the marketplace, boys who love soccer, women who would prefer to walk, had, by the beginning of the 1990s, become part of the process of identifying the need for new product and marketing segments. One internally circulated cross-training market analysis depicted a large triangle in the middle of a chart. Down one side of the chart, Nike products were divided into Max, top-of-the-line technologies, Perf, for performance, Core, the middle zone, or kill zone, as retailers say, where the lion's share of shoes would be sold, and Entry, the bottom of the category. Across the top was a far more abstract consumer spectrum. In the thinnest segment, in the middle where the apex of the triangle crossed the Max product category, a column read, 16 to 26, young hardbody sports driver. At the edge of the page, at the far end of the same spectrum, was the column reserved for the peer-driven, price-driven, and advertising-driven acolytes of the brand. It looked like market research, but then the document also resembled something found in the appendix of a New Age self-help text. You know, it never appeared to me as part of some grand strategy, Jim Riswold added. I mean, it's not 19th century German philosophy. What's so great about how we do things with Nike is that it all just kind of flows, like a bad case of the runs. It's not like working with General Foods or Procter & Gamble. The shoe industry still isn't carefully studied like the packaged goods industry. There aren't a lot of surveys and test runs, and that's the way I like it. In 1993, a year in which Nike was one of the first 3 companies to be inducted into the American Marketing Association Hall of Fame, with Coke and Absolute Vodka, Nike spent $250 million promoting products and the Nike brand. Brands considered for the Hall of Fame had to show sustained success, represent innovative and trailblazing marketing, and have had a dramatic impact on our lifestyle, becoming enshrined as American icons. We determined that we wanted Nike to be the world's best sports and fitness company, and the Nike brand to represent sports and fitness activities, Knight told an interviewer working for the Harvard Business Review. Once you say that, you have focus. One of the greatest challenges to both the breadth of the Nike brand and the company's internal way of life was the decision in 1987 to muscle into the women's sports and fitness market. A hard-edged, performance-oriented athletic approach to a larger population of women was tried at first, and the results were disastrous. In August 1989, a commercial showed the tough-as-nails female triathlete Joanne Ernst doing her athletic thing as just do it, repeated over and over in the background. Ernst comments at the end that it, complete physical freedom and the body of the goddess Nike herself, the commercial implied, would be more attainable if viewers could stop eating like a pig. The ad was pulled after 2 weeks of offending the less athletic women Nike needed to attract. Eventually, a cadre of nearly 40 women, hailing from various Nike and Wieden and Kennedy quarters, were drafted to the cause and set up shop inside the boys' club in Beaverton. From the beginning, the women of the new team realized they would have to succeed inside a society of men and women that had largely conformed to the jock and old Oregonian knack for sucking back feelings. A new dialogue print ad campaign from Wieden and Kennedy copywriter Janet Champ and art director Charlotte Moore addressed athletics as a personal experience of growth rather than a path to glory and physical power. Non-athletic themes abounded in the campaign. Marilyn Monroe was depicted with text that read, "A woman is often measured by all the outside things that don't even add up to what she is on the inside." Another dialogue ad addressed the relationship of mothers and daughters, and another depicted the emotional confusion of a girl in gym class. The male Nike managers in the room grew pale at plans to discuss acne. In fact, to ask the reader to recall when her acne produced protuberances larger than her breasts. The women's team wanted to discuss PMS, hardly a marketable phenomenon in most of the men's estimation, but the members of the women's team held their ground. 50,000 calls requesting the women's source book offered in the ads came into the 800 number during the first 8 weeks of the campaign. There were calls from therapists asking for reprints, and hundreds of mothers called to ask for copies of the ads for their daughters. Reporters called, and once again, Nike ads were treated like new plays or books. 250,000 calls inspired by the dialogue ads were fielded during the first 2 years of the campaign, and 2 months before Bill Worthington held his air carnivore aloft and spoke of it like Hamlet clutching that skull in mid-February 1993. The Nike women's dialogue phenomenon moved to national television. $12 million was invested in airtime for 3 black-and-white spots, with the actress Sigourney Weaver doing the voiceover. During 1992, Nike had passed Reebok-owned Avia to become the number 2 aerobics shoe. New shoes and programs aimed at the 1 out of every 3 schoolgirls now playing on an organized sports team were launched at regular intervals. By the beginning of the year, when the often interviewed trend watcher, Faith Popcorn, coined the term female think to describe a new trend that companies with brands to promote must learn to understand. Nike had been on the case for quite a while, and sales had grown by 20% during each of the preceding 3 years. In response to the marketing challenge presented by shopping patterns that don't tend to bring women into the kinds of sports specialty stores where Nike things are usually sold, the women's team was actively exploring dedicated Nike women's shops, Nike CD-ROM shopping, and even a Nike interactive television channel with a women's tilt. In the middle of March 1993, another Nike category made possible by the opening of new marketing segments, the outdoor stuff, also began to appear in national television ads. New high-tech fibers had been developed for the all-weather apparel, and a huge line of new shoes and boots was designed to be the 4x4 utility vehicles of footwear. Nike employees had been hired away from retail stores in Denver and Boulder, Colorado, where the most exacting outdoor technical gear customers like to shop. The marketing manager for the category, Ann Wiper, had been both a specialty outdoor retailer and a senior executive with Low Alpine Systems, Inc., maker of some of the best camping equipment. Specialists working for Black Diamond Equipment, Patagonia, the North Face, and other manufacturers of state-of-the-art gear were approached and sometimes hired, and the relatively tiny fraternity of outdoor companies shuddered as Nike bulled into their purview. The category grew by 100% during the year leading up to the spring of 1993. There are no hiking referees. No hiker has ever asked to have his hiking contract renegotiated, read one Nike outdoor print ad, apparently contradicting the team athlete focus of other sub-brands and categories. There are no loud or obnoxious hiking fans. No hiker has ever been picked last. No hiker has ever won, and no hiker has ever lost. To each sporting dream a product, to each product a discernible state of mind. Tom Hartje stood in front of a blackboard in his office one morning, trying to explain the company's latest version of the Matrix, a rangy structure of Nike corporate governance designed and constantly redesigned so as to retain the romance and collegiality of an entrepreneurial past, within the context of a big corporation forever being chased from behind. Nike's running shoe category still dominated the American market, but it was now the fourth largest category at Nike, behind basketball, cross-training, and kids. Because of the nature of the matrix, however, the Nike running shoe business was an extremely difficult entity to find. Along the top of the blackboard, Harchi listed footwear, apparel, advertising, sports marketing, and retail. He drew cylindrical silos that descended below each function. You see, I'm out here as the divisional marketing manager for running. My job is to influence everything that goes on across the matrix, Harchi said, drawing a thick and aggressive line into and through each silo. I'm an influence broker in terms of the matrix. The Nike matrix doesn't correspond to any standard matrix most organizational historians would recognize, or even to the more recent network corporate forms. Some Nike watchers have contended that the informal system of getting things done is some Oriental hybrid that Knight adopted from his long association with Japanese companies. After watching Japanese businessmen aver from negotiations in English to chat among themselves, Knight once decided to quietly learn Japanese. He spent 2 years taking lessons, and yet he found himself still unable to comprehend private conversation during a day of negotiating at a factory. They figured out that you were listening, Knight's Japanese ally Tom Sumeragi explained, so they switched to an older style of Japanese. Knight quit his lessons. Sometimes you have to acknowledge there are some games you can't win, he says now. Suppositions about Knight's essentially Oriental management style were made by the veteran sports writer Frank DeFord in a mid-1993 article about Nike published in Vanity Fair. I knew about Japanese companies before a lot of people because I was doing business there and took certain lessons away, Knight said. But the dominant culture at Nike comes from the playing field. The world of sports marks the way we talk to each other and how we relate. It's not like the imagined sports team in typical corporate parlance, but like a real team. Anyone can step up and make the play. Conversation about management mechanics, as such, runs counter to the anti-organization ethos. Nike employees go to great lengths not to reveal their corporate titles. "Oh, you want to know my bureaucratic title?" they will say if asked to identify their jobs. The idea of reporting to another employee elicits a similarly disdainful response, and the very word supervisor is as absent from the Nike vocabulary as the word fashion. Structure is necessary, bureaucracy is not, reads one of the many slogans listed in a draft of the Nike values and brand mission circulating during the spring. Perfect results count, began another oft-repeated line from the statement of company values. Not perfect process. Visitors who bounce around the matrix, as they say at Nike, soon realize that the capacity to influence others is a key to intra-corporate success. Harchi talks about lobbying various internal constituencies to get things done. People who don't like to get in other people's faces, as one executive put it, don't do well inside Nike. A certain force of personality and basic competence at Nike gamesmanship are essential. Bill Worthington finished the colorful drawings of his Air Carnivore during the winter in early 1992, after he surfed in the Pacific with the inspirational Econ, Duke Stump. The process of gaining acceptance for his radical-looking shoe began with an informal alliance-building process. Worthington won over Kevin Paulk, the young developer who works in the cross-training realm of the production and development silo. It would be Paulk's job to figure out how to make Worthington's design become a shoe. Kevin was the former Reebok guy, though he had actually become a Nike lover 21 years earlier at the age of 13, when a Nike guy set up a table near a track where Kevin was competing in Tucker, Georgia, and began to tell him romantic stories about his shoes. If the carnivore got the green light, Kevin would help select materials and figure out a price, and would coordinate a schedule that would extend to the production phase and the factories in Asia. Because making an athletic shoe so often seemed absurdly laborious, the Nike Internal Development Group decided to write down all the steps taken during the 15 months required to produce a new Nike shoe. The resulting document left out a lot of details, but when it was tacked up to a wall, someone measured the step-by-step map of a shoe and found that it was 60 feet long. And yet, a Nike developer working in a zone can glance at the drawings for a new shoe and know in 30 seconds what it will cost to make well. Bill worked hard to win over Tom Phillips, the category marketing manager for cross-training. Phillips liked the audacity of the carnivore. It was the kind of shoe that would help the cross-training category mean something again. Various representatives from different parts of the matrix sat down to listen to Bill Worthington present his product brief during the summer of 1992. Tinker Hatfield, who designed almost all of Nike's statement-level gear, was there with Sandy Bodeker and Tom Wolfe from design and development. Andy Mooney, the lean young Scotsman who oversees marketing by day and goes home to play rock guitar in his own studio at night, was in the room, as was Ron Hill, the former Brigham Young University baseball star, who hails from Nike merchandising and is therefore charged with balancing the retail mix of a line. Worthington's written brief began with photographs of competitors' cross-trainers. He wrote that the overall size of the cross-training shoe market would be $575 million during the 1992 fiscal year, and that Nike's 69% of the market would come out to $396 million in sales. The brief didn't mention that category sales had recently fallen by more than 30% after Bo was hurt, or that some people inside the matrix were saying that cross-training was over. But then everyone in the room knew that. Under a heading that read Confusion, Bill had written that confusion was being injected into the marketplace, largely by Reebok, which held 17.2% of the market. Reebok had a cross-trainer for tennis and another for basketball, which had muddied up the consumer perception of shoes that were supposed to be suitable for both those things. The brief said, Redefine, in huge letters. A concise history of cross-trainers began, ending with Riswold's image of Bo with the bat across his shoulder pads. No limitations, the brief said. Bo Jackson's commitment to athletics provides the most focused definition of cross-training's maximum level of product. Worthington noted some of the many new lab innovations that could be worked into the new shoe, but he also posited that what had been missing in other high-tech Nike cross-trainers of late was visual excitement. Since the reintroduction of Nike Air in 1987, 75% of all the shoes contained airbags instead of 25% in the past. But air alone was no longer enough. Certain Nike products were designed and marketed as brand identification tools, as statements. They existed to reorient, promote, or define a segment of Nike. The Air Carnivore would clearly assault and capture the eye and so support the mystique. Tinker Hatfield's new Air Max Plus, a running shoe and cross-trainer with an airbag literally bulging with extra cushioning, was selling out all over the country by the late spring. The shoe was a see it, want it, buy it kind of Nike sell. But the Carnivore was a shoe with ideas. Worthington talked about his anti-superhero, Bolt Stingwater. The Carnivore was a wild beast of a shoe. It was clearly part of the answer to the cross-trainer malaise in the wake of Bo's problems. This is a niche product. It's not the answer, said Ron Hill, the merchandiser. Someone asked if this wasn't perhaps the right shoe for Bo in rehab. Few people thought it was. The sellers will be able to romance this shoe. It's unique. It has its own history, Tom Phillips argued. And so the battles continued. The 1993 version of The Matrix, with all the designers and advertisers together in their own silo, assured a level of consistency that had clearly helped redefine and project the meaning of the Nike brand. But many of the employees inside the web found that good ideas too often died when development, marketing, or design representatives couldn't agree. It's easy to not be as knowledgeable about how your decisions and actions impact across the silos, Tom Clark stated in the flashy and often revealing new company newspaper, the Nike World Record. The problem was called silo blindness inside the berm. Even the sub-brands that had helped propel the company out of the abyss of 6 years earlier were being scrutinized and reassessed by the spring. We missed the outdoor basketball piece that Reebok jumped up and down on before we did because we couldn't figure out where it fit, complained advertising manager Scott Bedbury. Was it force? Was it flight? We got handcuffed. Criticism of the absence of a more coherent organizational form inside the company could also be heard regularly over coffee and healthy lunches. Some employees thought the Matrix was too political. Several of the go-aheads Tom Harchey had secured on new products and plans recently were widely thought to have resulted from his long, breathtakingly fast training runs with Tom Clark. Others, notably Tinker Hatfield, were considered classic Matrix cowboys, employees who were so good at finessing the Matrix that they had figured out how to get things done by circumventing the web altogether. The cowboys thought of themselves as creative and entrepreneurial, like Knight in the old days. Others disdained instinct-driven actions as the cause of the troubles of the 1980s. I fear that we no longer make quick decisions based on personal insights, Tinker Hatfield declared. It's true that I'm fed up with the corporateness of this culture. Some creative work must be done outside the Matrix. Few visitors to Nike from companies half its size would perceive a corporateness inside the berm. But then everyone from the outside who has ever sold Nike for a few years, or bought from them, or even spent a long time hanging out inside Nike, realizes that the culture, arrogant though it is so often accused of being, includes a ritual stream of self-criticism. The image-meister, Gordon Thompson, was stunned one day when Tom Clark asked him to redesign the swoosh, the ubiquitous Nike logo and symbol. But Thompson was nonetheless well into the work at hand, when Clark told him that it was merely an exercise in parallel thinking, designed to keep him sharp for the good of the Matrix, to keep him on his toes, in the way an employee should be at a loose-jointed and iconoclastic, risk-taking, hyper-competitive association of youthful would-be entrepreneurs, of a company that is forever, at least in some ideal sense, at play. Write the book, don't follow it, one of the repeated sayings goes. Think outside the box. And everything must happen fast. Though a process might have 60 feet worth of small print steps, that process will run along in overdrive at Nike. It's been running at such a high and fast level for several years now through this time of renaissance, Tinker Hatfield said. Sometimes I don't know what could rev me up again, but then I realize I'm addicted to the process. I'm completely addicted to the pace. And, like so many other people around here, I just can't live without the chase. For half a year, Bill Worthington and his allies among the pro-carnivore forces fought inside the Matrix. 7 months of screaming and yelling and team-building and refusing to give up, Bill remembered, fondling the Durabuck softness of the sample carnivore's green upper. The question now was whether the consumer would be able to appreciate the technology inside the shoe or to understand its true personality. There are no compasses inside the matrix. We ride on our gut feelings. I designed the carnivore for serious athletes. When it comes out in August, there won't be much advertising, and there won't be a statement athlete to help promote it. The shoe will have to sell on its merits, Bill said in his cool way, turning his invention pod side up. People will tell each other about the carnivore. They'll say, "Here's a shoe that represents the aggression of sports." Beaverton 3, September 1993. Charles Barkley loomed very large and foreboding in front of a much larger projected photo of his own most menacing glare. It was long past dinner time, by Barkley's reckoning. "I don't like memorizing lines," Charles said for the second time. "I'll do it better if I let the words kind of flow on out of me." All around him, Nike employees were busily completing the conversion of the basketball court inside the Bo Jackson Fitness Center into the scene of the next day's annual meeting of Nike shareholders. The gleaming hardwood floor was already covered by a rug, and the back of each of the hundreds of folding chairs arrayed in broad rows was being carefully draped with a red and white T-shirt bearing a big orange swoosh. A folder fat with printed material rested on each chair, some of the documents pertaining to the comparatively gloomy sales and earnings numbers that would be made public the next morning. Charles Barkley's oversized S-shaped body was clad in a short-sleeved tennis shirt, black jeans, and a very long and thick belt, embellished by a cowboy's silver buckle the size of a salad plate. When the 6-year-old son of Ron Parham, Nike's director of investor relations, charged up to Barkley, he barely reached his thigh. Jake Parham thrust one of the Nike T-shirts above his head. "Sign this," he crowed. Charles slowly lowered his head and stared, squinting for focus, as if the little boy was so far away that it took him a moment to lock in on his face. "Sign this, huh?" Barkley growled. "How's about instead if I just toss you down on the floor and stomp on your little chest till your guts come out your mouth?" Jake's jaw dropped. With his face fully horizontal and his neck craned backward so he could look up at the giant superstar's face, Jake's fully opened mouth looked like a hole on a putting green. After a moment, the famous scowl depicted on the oversized photograph near the temporary stage in the gym caved in and became a smirk. "Gimme that thing," Barkley teased, grabbing the T-shirt while Jake squealed with delight. Phil Knight trucked quickly into the gym, looking preoccupied. He had just left a meeting with the personnel committee of his board of directors, and Knight was still pondering the members of the committee's suggestion that a 55-year-old CEO of a major American company ought to be thinking seriously about succession. Knight was wearing a dark suit that was so much more deeply wrinkled and disheveled than usual that it looked as if the creases had been pressed into the fabric with an industrial steam iron. He scanned the darkened gymnasium slowly until he saw Barkley, who was standing near the far wall. Knight beamed as he approached, though Barkley had marshaled a convincingly threatening expression. Before Knight shook his hand, Charles was already complaining to Knight about the $500,000 in paper profits he'd given back as Nike's stock price fell from its $90 zenith to under $50. Barkley had apparently exercised his option to buy up to 20,000 shares per year at prices below market level. He had purchased $500,000 worth of Nike stock at $40 per share, and he'd watched with pleasure as the value of his holdings quickly doubled. When the stock hit $90, a few months after he played with the Dream Team in Barcelona, Charles had called Howard White to ask him if he should sell. "Put that stock in a drawer someplace, Charles," Howard had said. Barkley called his financial advisor, who told him the same thing. Then Barkley called Knight. "These last two jokers I asked wouldn't know $1 million if it bit 'em. Don't even know what $1 million looks like. So I'm asking you, should I sell?" "No way," Knight had said. Since Knight had spent weeks imagining an army of angry shareholders surging forth from the crowd at the annual meeting, he'd telephoned Charles Barkley 10 days earlier while Barkley was on vacation in Hawaii. "Now's your chance," Knight said. "Come to the annual meeting, and you can be the most irate shareholder of them all." "And I am irate, too," Barkley reiterated in the gym. "But then I hear that you lost some money, too," he said to Knight. "I hear tell you lost about $1 billion. Just how's that make a man feel?" "Makes him feel happy that he had it to lose," Knight countered, grinning away. Knight seemed happy, but extremely jumpy in conversation with Barkley, though the public business he would conduct over the next 24 hours had nothing to do with it. Though Knight arguably spent much more time with a wide array of the world's finest athletes than anyone else, he still became the shy and nervous fan in their presence. Knight could remember in great detail the thrill of having Nike athletes like Sidney Wicks and Elvin Hayes come to his country house in Sun River, Oregon. He remembered the day he realized that he and Rob Strasser were far more despondent over John McEnroe's loss at Wimbledon the year after he first won than were McEnroe's father or even McEnroe, the most powerful man in sport, which by now had become a standardized, ironic idiom inside the berm, got wired up around athletes because he saw them as modern saints. The empire builder receded into humility and shyness because he knew that he only had an empire because of great athletes and the way he perceived their greatness. For all the excitement of Barkley's company, very early the next morning there would begin one of those public days that had always caused Phil Knight a modicum of pain. A week earlier, Knight had summarily turned down requests for interviews from 60 Minutes and Good Morning America. The latter appearance would have been part of a segment focusing on Nike as one of the best places to work in America. Knight even happened to be in New York when the show was scheduled, but he still said no. In the morning, the drill would start as early as Bowerman's pre-dawn training sessions. At 6 a.m., the announcement would be made to hundreds of investors and securities analysts all over the world that the first quarter of the Nike fiscal year had gone poorly, according to standards set over the past 6 years. Expectations for the second quarter of the year weren't much better. Those who expected Nike to continue to rack up another year of huge increases and double-digit growth by the late spring of 1994, the morning announcement would convey, would probably be disappointed. The annual meeting would convene after that, and in the afternoon all employees working on the World Campus were invited to gather in the gym to witness a mock reenactment of the morning's shareholders' meeting. This year, for the first time since the beginning of the great surge of the past 6 years, Knight dreaded this last and most familial of the day's public responsibilities most of all. During the afternoon session with the employees, Knight would tell them of an immediate round of company-wide layoffs. The cost of running Nike had risen by 5% over the past year, and the extreme profitability of the company would be modified in the near future. But the underlying reason behind the cuts was largely informed by a desire to make room for new talent and to selectively prune the Nike populace after a lengthy hiring binge. The company remained the most profitable in the industry, and far from the dire financial straits of 1985 and 1986. The traumatic layoffs of those years meant that 600 employees were culled from a community of 2,000. This time, fewer than 250 employees would be cut from a team of nearly 10,000, but the plan worried Knight and made him feel as if he and Nike had let the employees down. Knight had vowed when the process of reinventing Nike began that a measure of the company's greatness would be that layoffs never occurred again. When he made the pledge, Knight had never imagined coaching a company so large that it now rolled out far beyond his capacity to know or even see it. But he also understood that the high-strung spirit of the company was born of a complex and volatile chemistry. Nelson Ferris, the longtime company vet and director of internal relations, had argued vociferously against the cuts. "Let's step up," Ferris said to GM Tom Clark. "Let's say that we're here to cover you during the bad times, and let's add that the 5% of you who aren't getting it have to change." Clark had replied that emotionally the idea sounded right. But this is one of those Nike business versus American business dilemmas we face from time to time. Knight had been sleepless, trying to calculate the psychic toll of the cost-cutting measure. He had become so preoccupied with what to say during the afternoon session that he had driven up to his house in rural Sun River 3 days earlier to think and be alone. Not that being alone wasn't a standard aspect of his days inside the berm. Knight stepped onto the stage and huddled with Dick Donahue, Tom Clark, and Ron Parham. Donahue and Clark raised their voices during a brief debate over the proper way to depict the 3 to 5% workforce reduction if any of the analysts sitting in on the mass conference call scheduled for the next morning asked about cost-cutting. "We reported $365 million in profit 3 months ago. We have $360 million in cash on hand. Why should we play up a cost-cutting measure that's really a pruning operation anyway?" Donahue argued. "Still, if anyone asks about layoffs in the morning," Knight said softly, backing Clark's position on openness, "we'll just tell them." A few feet away, Charles Barkley was handed a pair of the newly designed Air Max 2 CBs for Charles Barkley, due to premiere during the early weeks of 1994, and for the first time in a half hour, Charles stopped talking. He picked up one of the black shoes that were dotted with silver circles, and he reverently turned the size 9 prototype over and over. Barkley tried without success to thrust his hand inside the shoe, which was loaded with airbags that had been variously pressurized to conform with jumping and landing patterns. "It's real good," Barkley said. "When can I get a pair?" Someone asked if Knight was concerned that Barkley had balked at the idea of planning what he would say during the shareholders' meeting the next day. Knight briefly pondered some of Charles's other public performances, and he wondered if the Barkley stunt might backfire, as with a few too many plans of the last few weeks. Knight recalled that Barkley had recently gone to speak at the opening of an orphanage his Phoenix teammate Kevin Johnson worked to support. Charles got up in front of a large crowd of public officials and children, and told a few inspirational stories that all proved, he said, that you've got to just go and do it. You've got to just go for it. You've got to really believe if you want something. But then Barkley had paused, a twinkle in his eye. Then again, if you really get to thinking about it, you come to the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. Barkley had mused, referring to the Milwaukee serial killer who ate his victims. Now, Jeffrey Dahmer really believed, too. Jeffrey, he just went out and he... Knight was told Charles was still talking when Kevin Johnson dragged him away from the microphone. "Don't you worry now. I'll just get up there and wing it," Charles told Knight as he hoisted Howard White's 6-year-old daughter above his head. "I'll just say what needs to be said. God will come over me, and he will tell me what to say, so don't you worry about that one little bit." Deep blue and black bands of light arched across the sky as Knight's Acura roared through the opening in the berm at 5:45. For all the things the leader of Nike has been called over the years, a morning person has never been among them. The conference call was scheduled for 9 a.m. Wall Street time, 6 a.m. in Portland, so Dick Donahue had tried to convince Knight that the event would begin at 5:30, in hopes that the leader would be on hand when the hundreds of telephone connections were made. Runners were already moving through the dark morning when Knight pulled into his parking place. Employees arriving early for long runs or workouts at the Bow pedaled by on mountain bikes. A blind employee speed-walked along in front of the marble fountain with cane in hand, brightly saying good morning as she passed. Upstairs in the small and square Fenway room on the top floor of the McEnroe building, Dick Donahue was pacing back and forth, staring at a key. "I can't get into my goddamned office," Donahue roared, his Boston accent invariably more pronounced when he became agitated. Knight shuffled in, blinking, and immediately asked Liz Dolan to make coffee. The gender politics joke was one Knight repeated almost every time he greeted Dolan in the early morning. As per their script, Liz rolled her eyes, and Knight went off to find the coffee himself. By the time he returned and put his sunglasses down on the small table in the Fenway room, Donahue, Tom Clark, Ron Parham, and Bob Falcone, the chief financial officer, were already in position. They all looked sleepy, except for Tom Clark, who sat bolt upright and eager in a fashionable suit and tie, his hair falling well below his collar. The men all stared down at the middle of the table, at a low-lying gray plastic box with an undulating perforated top. "Gentlemen," said a voice from the box, "my name is Pete. I will be your teleconference operator this morning. We have around 120 people on the line now, and more are signing in as we speak. We'll be ready to go in just a moment." The audience would be largely composed of brokerage house and investment bank analysts. There were members of the financial and athletic goods industry press on the line, some institutional portfolio managers who held Nike shares, and several would-be large holders of the stock who had been identified and contacted on Nike's behalf by one of the thousands of ancillary financial services firms created in recent years, this one a Chicago company specializing in identifying appropriate new investors for large corporations. "Well, gentlemen," Ron Parham said in a hypothetical press conference voice, "do you expect to continue paying exorbitant fees to athletes in light of these numbers?" "Why, yes, as a matter of fact we do," Knight said, trying to rub life into his cheeks and eyes in a vigorous circular motion. Ron Parham picked up a phone and asked where Nike shares had opened. He grimaced and reported to the others that the quarterly news had hit the wires. Another $2 had been peeled from the price. Pete came back on the line and said the conference would begin in 20 seconds. Tom Clark leaned forward, as if at the beginning of a race. "Let's be aggressive here, gentlemen," he said. During the week after the shareholders' meeting, a Wall Street Journal article would posit that Nike was racing to remake its image. The feature did not mention all the internal soul-searching going on inside the berm, but the writer would suggest that the appearance of certain ads for the outdoor category's shoes and apparel were indications of an entirely new corporate purpose. Tom Clark would storm into Knight's office with the article in hand. "Why do we even talk to the Wall Street Journal? We spent 5 years building a constituency of tens of millions of people who understand that we're a sports and fitness company with 100 different purposes, and the press and some of the analysts can only think we're junking everything because they think nobody wants athletic shoes anymore. Every 15-year-old boy in America gets it. Maybe we should just communicate with them." For Clark, as with Knight, the business was definitely personal. When board members had questioned Knight about succession issues, he told members of the personnel committee that the next guy must come from within the company, but there's a lot of young talent around here. Knight had continued, "There are several people who are going to be getting a lot more responsibility in the near future, and I can watch what they do." The conference call began, with Knight speaking first. "When we left you last," he said in a very flat voice, "we were optimistic about the coming fiscal year. Now we have an all-time record year in terms of revenue, if the same rules and scorekeeping system of last year could be applied." He went on to blame currency exchange rates and the new tax laws for bringing the earnings lower. "We're positioned well. We have more growth coming, but it will always come with bumps, as it has over the last 10 years. Nike's value as an investment will be dictated by how well we chase the $2 billion in untapped business we see out there, and by whether or not we become the first truly global company in this industry." It was left to Clark to report the worst financial news, that futures orders for the coming period were valued at $724 million, less than the $800 million worth of orders during the first quarter of last year. Clark also reported a decline in the basketball category. Nike had sold close to $150 million worth of basketball shoes in the quarter, and still controlled 50% of the market, but sales were 16% lower than the previous year, which included a huge, nearly 20% rise in domestic sales in the wake of the Dream Team Olympics summer. Other categories were fine: cross-training up 34%, outdoor up 29%, women's footwear up 18%. But, Clark said, his voice trailing off, we will be down in '94. During the question and answer portion of the conference call, several Nike watchers on the line wondered why the company didn't buy up large blocks of its own stock at current prices. Such a stock buyback was typical of the kinds of maneuvers designed to support the price of shares that many conservative analysts and investors liked. After a past price downturn and stock buyback, the company's shares had appreciated by $80 million when the price went back up. But it's just not how I see Nike operating, Knight said as he walked across the campus toward the bow. I'm still a small businessman at heart, and I just can't imagine how a company that swallows itself will ever achieve greatness. Phil is a lot less comfortable than I am with the idea of stable growth, Ron Parham of Investor Relations said in the lobby of the Bow. He will go out and satisfy his desire for fast-paced, entrepreneurial growth outside the United States. And as much as I'd like us to be a stable company for the sake of Wall Street doesn't dictate what Nike will be. Parham had seen the way Nike's times of hypergrowth were invariably juxtaposed to sorry numbers when the cycles Knight talked about dictated a lull. Parham talked often about his and Wall Street's desire for several quarters of moderate growth in a row, but he knew that this went against the grain. From Knight's perspective, the company drew its vital energy from the extreme pace of the chase. Penny and Travis Knight had taken seats in the back of the gym as the shareholders filed in for the annual meeting. Penny, dressed in a tailored suit and wearing very long fingernails, chatted with her running partner, Howard Slusher. The two would both complete their first marathon in October. Penny did a 4:44, and Slusher, the dumb schmuck, he had to be taken to the hospital to be rehydrated. Knight would report after the race. 20-year-old Travis Knight, wearing an earring and very short blonde hair, stood next to his mother, waiting for the meeting to begin. The younger of Phil Knight's two sons looked more like a football player than a runner, though Travis was more interested in music than sports. A new compact disc by Chili Tea that had recently arrived in record stores around the country, featuring a single that was getting a bit of radio play called Get Off Mine, was in fact the work of Travis Knight. A year earlier, Travis had been drawn into a discussion of his future by his concerned father. Phil Knight wondered if perhaps Travis's interest in drawing and design might indicate it was time for him to get a low-level job with an architecture firm, but Travis said he wasn't much interested in that scenario. "Well, what do you really want to do?" Knight asked his son. "I want to be a rap star." Knight only helped out when it came time to hire an entertainment attorney. The CD was released by MCA, and Travis had already applied his advance to a new recording facility that was built into the family house in Hillsborough. "It sure makes you think about the psychology of fathers and sons," Knight said. "I thought a lot about my father going on about my own crazy notion. I'm really proud of Travis." Knight stood alone on the stage as the members of the Nike board of directors filed in, his hands in his pockets. Doug Hauser, one of the original board members and Knight's cousin, approached Tom Clark on one side of the stage. "I've got an idea," the Portland lawyer enthused. "How about baby shoes? Not just baby shoes, but baby shoes with different colored booties you slip inside." Tom Clark nodded very thoughtfully, clearly thinking about something else. Bill Bowerman, looking tanned and extremely fit, stood a few feet away, listening to the conversation and shaking his head from side to side. "Some of the guys on this board don't know which end of a damned shoe faces forward," Bowerman said, not bothering to lower his voice at all. Bowerman said he'd made at least a half-dozen pairs of shoes over the past year, though he added he'd gotten rid of the old-fashioned N-hexane-laced glue. "I find that some of my fellow board members have lost sight of the objective," Bowerman noted. Are the shoes light? Are they comfortable? Can they go the distance? Those are the fundamental questions. One thing about Bowerman, Knight had said earlier in the year, he has an amazing capacity to screw up all the facts at hand and still come to the right conclusion. That's a gift. I don't know how you ever got along with him, Bowerman's wife had said to Phil Knight one day when she'd accompanied Bill on a visit to Beaverton. Nobody else ever did. I could say the same to you, Knight had replied. Board member John Thompson, who looked much bigger than Charles Barkley, took his seat in the front. During a meeting of the board convened between the morning conference call and the shareholders' meeting, Thompson had been shown a good-looking new 1994 cross-trainer inspired by African runners. The shoe, he was told, was tentatively entitled the Black Massa. Just so it's not the White Massa, Thompson had replied. As the formal proceedings began, Thompson seemed to scan the faces in the crowd methodically, moving from row to row with his dark eyes. Many of the shareholders, who by now had filled all the seats in the bow, were among the oldest people to appear on the World Campus in months. As with most audiences attending the annual meetings of large corporations, the majority of the attendees were retired. Some of them lived comfortably because more than 20 years earlier they'd taken a flyer on a little shoe venture started up by the son of a Portland publisher, one of Bowerman's boys. 4 of the Oregonians sitting near the front of the room were among the original class of debenture owners who'd ponied up the $200,000 Knight needed to proceed in the Blue Ribbon sports days. During the question period after the various formal reports, film clips, and pep talks about the future, one of the multimillionaire original investors got up and began a long and rambling dissertation on the importance of keeping the stripe on the shoe. I mean, we've got to see the stripe in the morning paper. Knight smiled at the man and nodded in response to every point he made. It was clear that the meeting would not be marred by investor rancor as Knight had feared. The audience seemed mesmerized by each numeric celebration of the corporate story and each promise of more of the same. If you look at a graph, you'll see that the ride in this industry has always been bumpy, Knight said. But, as in the past, we will continue to ride up. Knight asked if there were any more questions, and a commotion ensued in the back of the room. A loud voice was heard to bellow, "I have a question! I have a question!" Several hundred people turned around in their seats to see Charles Barkley in a gigantic purple suit. Looking for all the world like a 252-pound grape, Charles began to steam toward the stage, glowering and shaking hands along the way. He bounded up next to Knight. "I demand to be heard," he proclaimed. For a while, Barkley played the angry shareholder part he'd been assigned, but eventually his tone softened. "You know," he said, looking out at the audience, "people are always bad-mouthing Nike for some reason. But the truth is, as hard as I play, Nike has taken me to places I could never have got through basketball alone. Nike has made me a whole lot of money, too. And you know, wherever I go, people ask me the same thing. They say, 'What's that guy Phil Knight really like?' And I always say the exact same thing to them." Charles declaimed as the corporate secretary duly recorded his words in the minutes, and Phil Knight began to grimace slightly because he'd already guessed what was coming. "I say, Phil Knight is the only guy I know with a whole lot of money who's not an asshole." The observation so entered in the corporate record, Charles hurried off to catch a plane to New York, where he was scheduled to host Saturday Night Live. During a gala summer sales meeting, a Nike version of Saturday Night Live had been staged, with Phil Knight in the leading role. Knight appeared in one skit doing a decent imitation of Marlon Brando playing the Godfather. The most powerful man in sport sat in his study like Don Corleone in the movie's famous wedding scene, supplicants approaching one after another to kiss his ring and ask for favors. Mike Krzyzewski appeared on stage, though the new Nike coach had at first balked at making the trip because a Nike employee spelled his name wrong. Not exactly a name that's easy to spell right, Knight had observed when told of the coach's ire. But Krzyzewski came and appeared before the laughing and cheering sales reps, bowing before the godfather of sport.
"Mikey, Mikey, Mikey," Knight rasped. "I have not always been pleased with you."
Joe Paterno pranced onto the stage to complain that he'd been a favorite Nike coach from the beginning, and now these new guys were muscling in on his territory. Then Andre Agassi, John McEnroe, and Jim Courier appeared behind Knight on film, bowing to the Godfather's demand that they play in the next Davis Cup tournament. Later, during a skit spoofing the Village People's song YMCA, Nike, Knight appeared again, this time in a leather motorcycle jacket and a leather cap turned to the side. He was bare-chested, except for heavy chains and an S&M-style harness ensemble. He even sang. Around the same time, the Nike video maker Michael Dougherty began to clown around during one of his Friday morning shows on Nike Free Radio, call letters KAOS, the World Campus radio station. "And next," Dougherty said, "maybe we can get Phil Knight to come down here and tell us just what he does with all his money." Within most large business organizations, the jest would have been regarded as an affront to propriety and inimical to the aura of managerial authority. In some companies, the kidding might have been viewed as an acceptable way to demythologize the leader for the good of morale. But at Nike, the ritual irreverence was essential. The recurrent injections of iconoclasm acted as inoculations against the encroachment of a bureaucratic and big business style that would indicate that Nike had become no different from the gray and soulless monoliths beyond the berm. Many of the employees who filed into the gym for the afternoon reenactment of the annual meeting would regard the high corporate formality as parody. The slightly ironic tone that Knight, Tom Clark, and the others would adopt. Then we got to the part where we tell them all, "Then we read all this formal stuff," would serve to subtly undermine the nuts and bolts expediency of the annual rite. The Nike Idol, the message was there to be read for those who would see, was still not amenable to spreadsheets. The reductionist talk of dollars and cents was still as removed from the true ethos of their corporate experience as history professors lecturing without passion about the youth culture of the time when Nike was born. Most of the employees still filing into the gym in the Bow were too young to have felt the dizzying historical compression of recent days, when a cook and restaurant owner in Corvallis, Oregon, had revealed herself to be Catherine Ann Powers, the suburban-born radical who'd been living underground since taking part in a bank robbery and fatal shooting in the angry year 1970. The front of the baby-boom Nike employees who felt the strange nostalgia of the event, the ones with graying hair or less hair than before, the ones who complained about their knees and hips in the locker room at the Bow before hitting the running trail, were also among those Nike employees who were startled to hear about the mail that came to Nike after the John Lennon Instant Karma ad campaign began. Apparently, young acolytes of the brand loved the commercial, but many of them wrote in to ask if the singer used in the commercial had made any singles or albums they could buy. On one recent late summer day, when dozens of Nike employees had gathered around tables set out on a patio overlooking the 7 acres of Lake Slusher, Michael Dougherty had looked up to see Knight standing over him with his lunch tray. Dougherty said he was finished with lunch and about to head back to work. "Just stay a while," Knight had said. "I don't know anybody here." "I do miss the old days," Knight had said. Those early entrepreneurial days, frankly, were more fun. There are only a few old-timers left that are friends of mine, and we were so footloose in those early days. For half of a century, students of management have studied and debated the nature of the traumatic transition of the successful entrepreneurial enterprise from an inspired adventure to a multifaceted organization run by managers. Those who remembered the early days would invariably regard the following generation of managers as mere bureaucrats, as caretakers who could at best perpetuate processes without passion, and, at worst, would bury the animating sensibility of the original cause and close out the golden age. Inside Nike, The entrepreneurial purity of the early dream was carefully protected, sanctified. The ethos of the upstart team on a roll was still regarded as the source of the culture's power. The team on the run, Knight would say. Everyone up to speed, everyone on the same squad. So those who were invited to join the life inside the berm tended to remember how it felt to win games. The years they missed were compressed and conveyed via images of Prefontaine and other athletes of a Nike stripe, in full glory, and by the presence of the old track geek and founder himself, the hip Walt Disney who's not dead yet, and by the contrived rituals of the tribe, covering up the laugh lines like a big pair of high-tech wraparound shades. Knight again stood alone on the stage as Nike employees filled up all the chairs. They filed 5 and 6 rows deep between the last rows of chairs and the walls, and they leaned against the railing from the oval running track suspended above the court. Along the ceiling of the gym above them, so high in the rafters that they were easy to miss, were colorful banners hung like the pennants in sports arenas, honoring bygone winning seasons and the retired numbers of former members of the team. Dan Wyden and David Kennedy's names were on separate flags, as were the names of the Nisho Iwai executives Masaru Hayami and Tom Sumeragi, men who'd stood by Knight in the early days when American bankers pulled the plug. A few lower and middle-level employees who had died had flags at the top of the gym, as did the compulsive Nike Air inventor, Frank Rudy, and the first employee, Jeff Johnson. As Knight looked out into the gym, he sensed the alarm and confusion in the room. The news of job cutbacks had spread electronically to employees in all corners of the global web by mid-afternoon. Knight pondered the fact that many of the employees staring up at him were too young to have known the times when Nike hung by a thread. Of every 1,000 Nike employees, some 800 of them only knew the incredible streak of the past 6 years. Nike was to them less a team than a dynasty. The sight of their fear made Knight think of the thousands of bright-eyed $200,000-a-year Wall Street kids laid off en masse after the stock crash of 1987. He remembered the interviews with some of them when the axe fell. They had all been lulled into thinking that bull markets could last forever. They didn't understand business dreams rode along atop cycles and waves. Knight, Tom Clark, Donahue, and Mark Parker walked the employees through a compressed version of the shareholders' meeting. Then Knight asked for questions. He seemed somewhat pleased by a woman near the front who asked about the general response senior management had gotten to one of the new commercials she had just seen as part of the presentation. The commercial featured the towering volleyball star, Vogue model, and rookie Nike endorser, Gabrielle Reese. The beautiful athlete was depicted lounging languorously across unkempt pink satin sheets in some shots of the commercials, and viciously spiking volleyballs and diving through the air in others. Well, we try to work with our women athletes to use them in our communication, Knight said, but then with a knowing smile, he asked, "What was your response?" "She's a woman athlete presented as a sex kitten and therefore less seriously," the employee responded in a clear voice. "We wouldn't see Charles Barkley in that bed." Next, Donahue talked about China. "It's so huge and we don't have to have it all. We only need a bit at the top." As a chart behind him showed that there were 11,812 people in China for every pair of athletic shoes sold there within a year, compared to the 4 residents of the United States per each pair of retailed shoes. Tom Clark described the tragedy of Quincy Watts's broken shoe before someone asked Knight about the CAA and Mike Ovitt's relationship. "It's all overblown in the press," Knight said. The layoffs were only mentioned in passing. Knight mentioned a 3% reduction, but then Tom Clark referred to workforce cuts of 4% a few minutes later. 3. Hundreds of people whispered, as if on cue. When there were no more questions, after a long pause, Knight stepped up to the microphone. Over the last 6 years, Nike has added 3,800 jobs, Knight said. If we had been perfect, we would have added 3,500. Or basically, we were off by 1.5% each year. If you are a professional manager, that doesn't bother you. But nobody has ever accused me of being a professional manager. I know that the average Nike employee will not be on the cover of Sports Illustrated. But I also know that without the average Nike employee, I wouldn't be on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Knight stared up into the crowd. Without the Nike employee, I'm a rumpled suit and a pair of Oakley sunglasses. Without the Nike employee, there's no me. That is why these things are so painful, and that is why I personally hate Paul Fireman, Rob Strasser, and Gib Ford. I hope you can understand that at this moment. I wouldn't trade places with any company in this industry. I think our opportunities and challenges have never been greater. There is an opportunity to be the first in this screwy industry, to be a true global company. There's $2 billion worth of sales out there. And I wouldn't say the opportunities are in the international division alone. It isn't enough to just win in Germany and not win in the United States. Nike is as American as Coca-Cola. Nike's opportunities have never been better. Let's win. With that, the strains of Through the Storm boomed through the high-efficiency speakers, and a newly culled series of slow-motion ballets performed by Barclay, Pippin, Harold Miner, and Sergei Bubka appeared on a screen behind Knight's head. The new clips included shots of athletes hitting the floor and turf and ramming into the steel poles that hold up the baskets. Some of the employees sitting in the bow stayed in their seats to watch the film, their faces reflecting the pain and glory as the sports moments cascaded across the screen. But others had jumped up quickly and moved to the door. Many heads were bowed in the crowd, waiting to exit the gym, and conversation was strangely subdued. Knight stood on the stage, looking out, his jaw clenched, until most of the employees had left the gym. I looked out at the end of that meeting, and I could see it, a schism, a divide. Knight remembered over dinner near the end of 1993. Some of them never wavered from understanding that Nike is special, not just a business, but something more, something of which business is only part. But I could see others, particularly the ones who came on board over the last few years, thinking that after all they'd done and been taught to believe, it was just another business after all. Not long after the Taekwang Rubber Company closed down the T3 plant in Busan, several Ekans in the field, a lot of secretaries, the guy who coordinated the Ekan visits to the World Campus, the sports marketing guy who was in daily contact with Alonzo Mourning, and other members of the Nike tribe had been asked to move on. As the employee cuts ran up over 200, most departmental managers saw that attrition would allow them to consolidate further. The pall that settled over the World Campus after the September annual meeting lifted slightly when word of a more inspired and well-received Fall '94 line went around. But then Michael Jordan retired in October, and the world inside the berm was rocked again. When Knight talked to Jordan on the phone about his plans before leaving to join him for the retirement announcement in Chicago, he told the star that he'd understood that his departure was coming for quite a while. When Jordan's entourage had arrived at the Bulls practice center on the morning of the press conference, Knight walked past the wife of the Bulls coach, Phil Jackson, who was completely dissolved in tears. Knight shook hands with NBA Commissioner David Stern, his ally and nemesis in the making of the dream of Michael Jordan, and the remaking of an American game. The two men went into an empty office and closed the door. "What do you think?" Stern asked. "I have mixed feelings," Knight said. "I'm happy for him, but I feel the impact personally, the loss, and I'm concerned about the impact on the company." "This is happy time," Stern said. "Magic Johnson retiring because he was sick was sad. We should be happy." Knight stared long enough to make sure that Stern was being sincere. "Yeah," Knight said. "I think you're right." Jordan was in Beaverton several times before the end of the year. A small casual line of Jordan shoes, shirts, and jackets was quickly designed and scheduled for the spring of 1994, and several NBA players known for the finesse and style of their play, Harold Miner and the Seattle star Kendall Gill among them, were told that they would henceforth wear Air Jordans, as would the players on the University of North Carolina basketball team. Jordan even had an office at Nike now, the only office on Knight's side of the fourth floor of the McEnroe building, though even the hero down the hall didn't wander at will into the inner office with the dark wood. Back in Chicago, Jordan began to spend more time outside of his private enclosure, chatting with other diners at Michael Jordan's restaurant. He was spotted playing cards at various country clubs in the area. "I have a new goal now, gentlemen," Jordan told a group of men at a card table inside a country club catering to a largely Jewish membership. "I plan to be the first black man in the Gin Rummy Hall of Fame." During the early weeks of 1994, Jordan began to pursue the goal of playing baseball for the Chicago White Sox, just as he'd told Knight, Tinker Hatfield, and Howard White he would do the night he retired. Just before he began watching Major League fastballs and curves hurtle toward him, Jordan had gone skiing for the first time. He spoke with such enthusiasm about the experience that friends began to wonder if downhill racing wasn't next on Jordan's experiential agenda. A few weeks after Jordan retired, Stephen Roth, owner of the Essex House of Fashion in Newark, accepted a buyout offer from the largest retailer on Market Street and closed up shop. From very different ends of the spectrum, I guess Michael and I did have similar philosophies about backing away. Stephen said, "I've got 3 children at home I didn't get to see often enough. I'd made enough money, and I was just too overworked. I wanted to get back to a more normal life. The American dream includes not doing things you just don't have to do, just like Michael says." On the last Saturday in October, Rob Strasser died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 46. Knight and other veterans at Nike spent much of the following week reminiscing and wondering whether or not to attend the funeral. Some of the senior Nike managers who'd kept up with Strasser said that Rob's blood pressure had been up around 240/210. Others talked of the rigors of the seemingly impossible task Rob had set out for himself, saving old Adidas and sticking it to Nike along the way. Knight seemed unable to separate his shock over the tragedy, the pleasure he clearly drew from recalling the Strasser of the Halcyon days, and the injuries he'd suffered from things Strasser had said and done, and claimed to have done, in recent years. Knight's photograph appeared in the Oregonian, the caption offering a rare quote. "I knew Rob Strasser over 20 years in a variety of capacities, including lawyer, colleague, friend, competitor, and enemy. I was greatly saddened by his death, and choose to remember the many grand adventures and good times we shared together." On the Monday morning after Strasser died, Nike stock rose by $3.50. A subsequent article in the Oregonian described the funeral that Knight, Slusher, and many others from Nike did not attend. While an image of Strasser's sunburned face smiled slyly down on them, most of the 8 people who paraded to the lectern Monday spoke of war. There was discussion of the parallels between the generalships of Strasser and George Patton. There was talk of combat in the arena of sports merchandising. There were the inevitable warlike allusions to Nike, which plays the Death Star in the Adidas universe. You start to wonder, the Oregonian's writer added, just what goes on in the sports and apparel and footwear business anyway? It's just a business about games, isn't it? It was never a game to Rob, Sonny Vaccaro said after the funeral. The mission killed him. He worked himself to death, and it's never been a game for Phil either. Just before Strasser's death, Nike's jockeying for position on the grassroots urban basketball scene led some of his colleagues at Nike to question whether Howard White had fraternized inappropriately with Sonny Vaccaro and Adidas. At first, Knight ignored reports from other managers that phone records indicated Howard had telephoned Sonny Vaccaro after having conversations with Knight. But when he was told that White might have set up a dummy company office in Portland, he agreed to further investigations. Knight told Howard to take some time off, and by January 1994, the industry coursed with news that the FBI had become involved in the investigation. Inside the berm, some speculated that before he died, Strasser had stepped up the level of the blood feud in an effort to buy off one of Knight's closest friends inside the company. But Howard White was totally exonerated by the FBI and Nike. There was no dummy corporation. Some of the phone calls, thought to have been made to Vaccaro, were in fact placed to White's old friend, the broadcaster, Ahmad Rashad. When Phil told me to take some time off, I said I'd done nothing wrong, but I told him to go ahead and do what he had to do, White said after the incident had passed. I knew that being so close to Phil and Michael made people inside and outside the company want to take shots at me. I was surprised when it got to the FBI, but in a way that was a good thing, because everyone knew they would bring out the truth. I knew that in the past people like Rob and Sonny have gotten real close to Phil, and then something happened between them, and they were suddenly on the other side. I also know that this is a big league corporation now, and not the little intimate company I came to 12 years back. All I ever cared about was PK's take on it, because to me, Phil Knight and Nike are one, like the same thing. Phil and I never stopped talking through the whole deal, and when he told me to take time off, he sent my whole family to the Bahamas. Tests like this go both ways, and I think Phil came through strong. We were all stronger in the end. In a way, Howard White said, I was glad the thing came at me, because I think there are others who would have lost their jobs. Knight had told his troops gathered for the mock annual meeting in September that he hated Paul Fireman of Reebok, but some of the senior executives present took the statement with a grain of salt. By then they had heard about what had happened at the U.S. Open a few weeks earlier. Paul Fireman was sitting in the Reebok box close to the court when a man in a black suit stepped in front of him and extended his hand. "Mr. Fireman," the man said, "I'm Philip Knight." An ex-Nike Reebok executive Knight had always liked, Tom Carmody, had come over to say hello to Knight. "You know what," Knight said, "if I'm ever going to meet that son of a bitch, I think you're the one to introduce us." Knight took an empty seat next to Fireman after they shook hands, and they chatted for 10 minutes about tennis and the business environment in Europe. A friend of Knight's, the Lehman Brothers banker, Ken Tuckman, gazed over from a nearby box and referred to another historic reckoning of the same month. First the PLO and the Israelis, and now Knight and Fireman, Tuckman said. "I really don't think I can take much more." "He was gracious," Fireman reported. "After 14 years, we've finally broken the ice." "We had our picture taken," Knight told the others back inside the berm. "I was on a step, so I looked much, much bigger." "Rob's dead and Fireman is a real person," one Nike executive commented when news of the fraternization spread. "Who are we going to fight now?" "The ferocity is still intact," Knight said over dinner at the end of the year, "but it's time to rethink certain aspects of the quest. Nobody in this company has been taught to be content to simply manage. We grew from a $1 billion business into a $4 billion global organization in just a few years, and we still managed to keep Nike special. Now we have to grow even larger without becoming formulaic. 7 years ago, we struggled to figure out who we were," he continued, sipping at his white wine. "We resurrected Nike as a sports and fitness company, and our television advertising and our marketing triumphs were energized because, unlike most companies, we were sure about why we were here. We have to do something much less radical now, which is to look hard at the corporation, at the form. I honestly think some of the younger people at Nike might be able to balance creativity and organization better than I can. Maybe they'll be better able to mix the past and the future, the creative and the managed." During the early weeks of 1994, Knight would seek the counsel of various management theorists. He would discuss issues of transition with Kenichi Omai and with Jeffrey Pfeffer, a professor of organizational behavior at the Stanford Business School. A local management consultant, Don Murray, would begin taking soundings among the young senior managers, and Knight was surprised by how dissatisfied most of them were with the current structure, and by how very much most of them felt it was time to change the corporate guard. Some said they were extremely concerned that Knight would not choose Tom Clark to be the next president, when Dick Donahue's contract expired in June 1994, and that Clark would leave the fold. Knight knew that the current business lull was not thought to be amenable to a fix generated by new heroes. In many ways, the internal cult of sports authenticity had boxed the company in. Certain kinds of acquisitions and even products seemed to run against a Nike moral order that was in need of change. Knight seemed energized by the soul-searching and external adversity. "There's an aura of challenge, again," he agreed. "It does tend to concentrate your mind." At the end of January, a few days before the annual Super Show in Atlanta, and less than 2 weeks before the Winter Olympics were scheduled to commence in Norway, Knight surged briefly into public view when he came to the defense of the embattled figure skater Tonya Harding. In a letter to employees explaining his decision to donate $25,000 toward Harding's defense of her right to skate in the Olympics, Knight wrote that he didn't know whether or not Harding was guilty of the attack on rival U.S. skater Nancy Kerrigan, but he was sure that a possible U.S. Olympic Committee move to force her to withdraw from the team before she was found guilty in court violated both his own understanding of due process and a venerable Nike tradition. 20 years ago, another athlete who didn't quite fit the mold, Steve Prefontaine, fought a battle with the AAU, the governing body that ruled amateur athletics in those days, and Nike was at his side. Before announcing the donation, Knight had Liz Dolan phone Harding's attorneys to warn them of Nike's long history of antagonistic relationships with international sporting authorities. But the lawyers and Harding, a Portland native who previously had only received a free set of sweats from Nike, said they welcomed Nike's support. Knight gave sharp interviews to ESPN, NPR, Larry King Live, and The Today Show. He said that Nike would always argue the case of an athlete over an athletic bureaucracy, and he posited that if Harding were eventually proven guilty, her medals could be taken away. "If, in fact, she is proven innocent, and yet doesn't get to skate," he said during the ESPN interview, "you can never repair that damage, ever." Knight was clearly fired up by the controversy, and everyone on the World campus could sense the return of the old elan. In February, with the stock price already 20% above the lows reached around the time of the shareholders' meeting, Knight would announce that Dick Donahue was stepping down. Tom Clark would be the new corporate president. When Donahue had assumed the presidency from outside the berm 4 years earlier, he had said that his job was to help identify the next generation of managers, which he had. Clark would take over later during the year, around the time the stock price surged back above $60 per share, just before the basketball shoe business rebounded from its slump, and before Knight would pursue the idea of buying the New York Knicks and New York Rangers, before deciding the price for the teams and an attendant television sports network was simply too high. By the end of 1994, the stock would rise above $70 a share, with reports of increased earnings and orders for the winter and spring of 1995 that were up by 34%. Knight would also okay a promotional deal with the National Hockey League, and the $385 million takeover of CanStar, the largest hockey equipment manufacturer, though Knight would admit that hockey had never been a personal passion. "Whatever happens, I'm still here," Knight said over dinner that evening in Portland. "I would like to stay around as a kind of senior presence, as a teacher, but I'll have to learn to find that middle ground. There's a side of me that goes in for relentless pursuit, and another side that tends to back completely away." It was hard to back away as Michael Jordan had backed away from games, because Knight knew he had guided the creation of an institution that transcended the games Nike celebrated. Nike now imprinted daily life in ways Knight never could have imagined when he started selling track shoes. He easily agreed that the recent hold of sports upon the popular imagination was in some part due to the way the fear of being blown up and other contemporary preoccupations had freed up emotions and people's time. But there were still competitors to fight, a few athletes still not draped in or performing atop his wares, and if people's closets were indeed getting full because Nike had helped make the shoes so remarkably essential, then there were other businesses and ideas connected to games that were still unexplored. "Who knows?" Knight said in the restaurant parking lot. "Maybe I'll end up going off to open up a Taco Bell or something. People are coming into the company who do what they do better than I. I'm just a generalist, one of those entrepreneurs my college professor said would always eat lunch alone, off to the side. Sometimes I think there's only a few of us left." Knight nodded and smiled in a way that indicated that only part of what he'd just said was true. Then he jacked himself into his sleek black car, gunned the engine, and drove off, going fast, as if racing toward that finish line that isn't there.